Clara Whitmore's knuckles turned white around the folded quilt in her arms, and she did not let go. Not even when the man's shadow fell over her. "This one ain't for sale," she said, voice shaking, but her chin lifted high. "None of them are. Not anymore." Behind her, 3 wagons rolled to a stop, and the men climbing down from them were not customers. They had come to take back what they claimed had never been hers at all. If you've ever had to fight for something that was yours by every right, except the paper that says, "So, stay with me to the end of this story, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story has traveled." Don't forget to subscribe before we begin, because Clara's fight is only getting started. The morning had started ordinary enough. Clara Whitmore had walked her mule and wagon up the long dirt road to the Hale Ranch, with 11 quilts folded in canvas. Her hands raw from 3 days of travel, her stomach hollow from skipping breakfast to save the last of her coin. A woman in Cheyenne had told her the rancher past Willow Creek paid fair prices and didn't haggle a woman down to nothing for traveling alone. Ethan Hale had come out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag, squinting at the wagon, then at her. Tall, sun-worn, with the kind of quiet that made most folks nervous, and made Clara oddly feel like she could breathe. "You selling or passing through?" he asked. "Selling," she said. "Quilts. Best stitching you'll find between here and Denver, and I don't say that to boast. I say it because it's true." He'd walked around the wagon, slow, lifting the canvas, running his thumb along one seam, like he was reading a letter. "Who taught you this pattern?" "My mother." "She's still living?" "No, sir." He nodded once, like that answered something else entirely, something he didn't say out loud. "I'll take all 11. Clara blinked. "All of them?" "You heard me right." "Mister, that's a lot of money for a man who runs cattle, not a dry goods store. Bunkhouse full of men sleeping under army blankets thin as paper, and winter comes early up here." He looked at her again longer. "And you look like you haven't eaten today." "I'm fine." "Didn't ask if you were fine. Asked if you'd eaten." She hadn't had an answer for that, not one that wouldn't have given her away, so she'd said nothing, and he'd taken her silence for what it was. "Come up to the house when we're done here. Cook's got stew on. You can eat before you head back down the mountain." That was when the wagons came. She heard them before she saw them, 3 sets of wheels grinding gravel, moving too fast for a friendly visit, too slow for men in a hurry to get somewhere else. Ethan heard it too. She watched something shift in his shoulders, the easy stance falling away, replaced by something more like a man bracing a fence post before a storm. The lead wagon stopped first, and the man who climbed down did not tip his hat. He wore a suit too fine for ranch country, and his eyes went straight to Clara, like he'd been looking for her specifically, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending otherwise. "Clara Whitmore," he said. Not a question. Her whole body went still. The quilt in her arms felt suddenly like the only solid thing left in the world, and she gripped it tighter. "Do I know you?" "You don't have to know me. You have to know who sent me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, holding it not toward her, but toward Ethan, as if she were a matter to be settled between men and not a woman standing 3 feet away with her own voice. "Garrett Thorne. I represent the Mercer Trading Company. That woman is in breach of a production contract, and everything in that wagon belongs to my employer." Ethan didn't take the paper. "Funny. Looks like her wagon to me. The patterns are proprietary. Registered. Every stitch a Mercer-trained seamstress produces belongs to the company until her debt is paid in full, and Miss Whitmore's debt is far from paid." "I don't sew for the company anymore," Clara said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I left. 8 months ago." "You didn't leave. You absconded. There's a difference, and the difference has a price." Ethan stepped forward. Then not fast, not dramatic, just one long stride that put him between Clara and the paper. Thorne was still holding out like an accusation. "Those quilts don't belong to you," he said. "I just bought them, paid the lady in full fair price her hand to mine. That makes them mine now, and unless you've got a Wyoming judge's signature on that paper, instead of some company man's in a city I never heard of, You're going to want to climb back in that wagon. Thorne's mouth curled, not quite a smile. Then you came a long way to be wrong, Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale, this isn't a dispute over one wagon load of blankets. Miss Whitmore signed an indenture at 14 years old. Her mother signed it for her. Every pattern she has ever stitched, every pattern she will ever stitch belongs to the Mercer Trading Company until that debt is satisfied. She hasn't satisfied it. She ran instead. I ran, Clara said. Because I realized I was never going to be allowed to stop running in place. 14 years, Mr. Thorne. 14 years of stitching for wages that never once covered what you claimed I owed. That's not a debt. That's a cage with numbers painted on it. That's the law. That's your law. The two other wagons had emptied by then, 4 more men fanning out slow along the fence line, not rushing, just letting their presence be known. Clara felt her pulse in her throat. She had seen this before, men standing still and letting the stillness do the threatening. Ethan, she said quietly, and it was the first time she'd used his name. They found me. He didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes on Thorne. Then I reckon they're about to lose you again. Mr. Hale, I'd think carefully before you make an enemy of a company with lawyers in 3 territories. I'd think carefully before you make an enemy of a rancher with 40 men who'd walk into a fire if I told them to, and every one of them standing on my land right now. Ethan's voice hadn't risen once. That was the part that unsettled Thorne. Clara could see it the way his jaw tightened at a threat, delivered with no heat behind it at all, just fact. We're not asking for a fight. Good. Then you'll be leaving without one. Thorne folded the paper back into his coat with the careful motion of a man buying himself time to think. His eyes slid to Clara again. You understand this isn't finished. A man can buy a wagon load of quilts. He cannot buy a person out of a legal debt. I'm not a debt, Clara said. I never was. Tell yourself that in the winter, Miss Whitmore, when the company stops being generous about where you've run to. He turned back to his wagon, then paused, looking at Ethan one more time. You should ask her what happened to the last man who tried to shelter her. Clara's stomach dropped, not from surprise, but from the particular horror of hearing a private wound spoken aloud as a weapon. That's not... she started, but Thorne was already climbing up, already snapping the reins, and the 3 wagons pulled away in a column of dust that hung in the summer air long after the sound of the wheels had faded. Silence came down over the yard like something physical. Ethan turned to her first. What did he mean by that? Nothing you need to worry about. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her name either, and something about the plainness of it, no title, no distance, made her want to sit down in the dirt and finally stop holding herself upright. I just told a company of lawyers to get off my land for you. I think I've earned knowing what kind of trouble I bought along with those quilts. She looked at the quilt still clutched to her chest, the one she hadn't let go of through the entire exchange, and for the first time, she loosened her grip just slightly. There was a family in Laramie. Took me in for a season. The company sent men same as today, except there wasn't anybody there like you to stand in front of the wagon. What happened to them? The husband lost his freighting contract inside of a month. Company had connections with the men who awarded it. Wasn't violence. Wasn't even a threat you could point to and call illegal. Just a door quietly closed, and then another, until they couldn't feed their own children, let alone shelter mine. Her voice caught on the last word, and she heard it too late to stop it. Yours. Ethan repeated, gentle, not pushing, just marking the word so she'd know he'd heard it. I meant it the way you mean a person who's yours to protect, even if she isn't kin. She shook her head. I should go. I never should have come up this road. Where would you go? I don't know. Somewhere they haven't looked yet. That's not a place. That's just running with extra steps. He said it without unkindness, but it landed like truth, landed blunt and unavoidable. You said there was stew. I don't think I have much appetite left, Mr. Hale. Ethan, she said, and something in her chest loosened at saying it, small as that was. Come inside anyway. Eat something. Then we'll talk about what happens next, and you'll do it with a full stomach instead of an empty one, because I've noticed empty stomachs make for poor decisions. She hesitated at the porch steps, one hand still resting on the quilt, now tucked under her arm, instead of crushed against her chest. You don't know me. You don't owe me a meal, let alone a fight with a company that just threatened you to your face. I know you make the finest stitching I've seen come through this territory. I know you've been running 8 months on your own with nobody standing between you and men like that. And I know a man doesn't get to call himself decent if he only stands up for folks when it's convenient. He held the door. Stew's getting cold. Inside the ranch house smelled of wood smoke and simmered beef, and the quiet was a different kind of quiet than the yard had been warmer, unhurried. An older woman, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, looked up from the stove and took one glance at Clara's face before setting down 2 bowls instead of one without being asked. This is Martha, Ethan said. Runs this kitchen better than I run the whole outfit. Sit, Martha said, not unkindly in the tone of a woman who had fed frightened strangers before, and understood there was no use making a ceremony of it. Clara sat. For a while, nobody spoke. The stew was thick with potatoes and carrots, and meat cooked so long it fell apart at the touch of a spoon. And Clara ate like a woman who hadn't realized how hungry she was, until the first bite reminded her body what hunger felt like when it wasn't being ignored on purpose. Better? Ethan asked once her bowl was half empty. Better, she admitted. Now, tell me about the debt. She set her spoon down. There isn't much dignity in the telling. Didn't ask for dignity, asked for the truth. Clara looked at her hands, at the calluses on her fingers, built from a decade and a half of needlework, at the small burn scar on her left thumb, from a flat iron she'd been made to use at age 9 because a client had complained about wrinkled linen. My mother came to the Mercer Works when I was small. Widow, no trade of her own, no family to take us in. The company offered lodging and wages for training. Sounded like charity. Her mouth twisted. It was a contract written so a desperate woman would never read the clause saying her daughter's labor belonged to the company too, the moment she was old enough to hold a needle. You were how old? 9 when I started sewing for wages. 14 when they had me sign my own indenture on account of my mother passing that winter, and somebody deciding a minor couldn't simply inherit a debt without putting her name to it herself. Martha, still standing near the stove, made a small sound in her throat, something between disgust and sorrow, but said nothing, letting Clara keep the floor. Every pattern I stitched belonged to them. Every yard of cloth I touched went into their ledger as an expense against what I owed for lodging food, thread needles, even the lamp oil I used to see by at night. The debt never went down, Ethan. I worked 14 hours a day for 14 years, and the number in that ledger only ever grew. That's not a debt. That's slavery with better paperwork. I told Thorne something close to that today. A small, tired smile crossed her face, gone as quick as it came. He didn't care for the comparison. When did you leave? 8 months ago. There was a night shipment of quilts headed to Cheyenne, and I was meant to travel with the wagon as far as the depot to catalog the goods on arrival. I never got off at the depot. Kept walking instead, and I haven't stopped since, except when I had to. Except when a family in Laramie let me stop for a season before the company found me and made sure that stopping cost them everything. And you've been alone since. I've had my wagon, my mule, and 11 quilts I made from memory, without a supervisor standing over my shoulder telling me the pattern wasn't Mercer approved. She looked up at him. That's the part they can't put a number to in their ledger, Ethan. For the first time in my life, the stitching was mine. Not theirs. Mine. Ethan was quiet a long moment, turning his own spoon slow in his bowl without eating. They'll come back. I know. Not with papers next time, I'd wager. Thorne doesn't strike me as a man who enjoys losing an argument in front of witnesses. I should leave before they do. I won't bring that kind of trouble down on your men, on Martha, on... She stopped herself before she said his name a third time, though it hung there anyway, unspoken but understood. You'll do no such thing, Martha said flatly, setting a slice of bread down beside Clara's bowl, like the matter was settled and always had been. Clara looked between the two of them, the rancher and his cook. Neither one blinking at the notion of standing between her and a company with lawyers in 3 territories, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't let crack in 8 months of running. Something that felt dangerously close to hope, and hope in her experience was the most expensive thing a person could afford to feel. "Why?" she asked, quieter than she meant to. "Why would either of you take this on? You don't know me. I showed up this morning selling quilts, and by supper, I've made your ranch a target." Ethan set his spoon down entirely. "You want the honest answer or the polite one?" "I've had enough polite answers from men in fine coats today." "Fair enough." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she'd met him that morning, something in his face looked less guarded, like a door left open half an inch. "I lost my wife 3 summers back. Fever took her quick, faster than a man can prepare for, no matter what he tells himself beforehand. I spent a long while after that deciding the safest thing a man could do was keep his gate closed and his business to himself, on account of caring about people only ever seems to end in losing them." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. "Don't need sorry. Need you to understand what I mean when I say this morning, you stood in my yard holding a quilt like it was the only thing in the world worth fighting for, and a man with lawyers told you it wasn't even yours to hold. I know something about having the thing you love taken from you by forces bigger than you are. I couldn't do a damn thing about the fever. I can do something about Thorn." He looked at her steady, no softness in it, just plain fact laid bare on the table between them. "So I intend to." Clara didn't have an answer for that, not one that wouldn't have betrayed how much the words had moved her, so she said nothing and let the quiet sit. And for the first time in 8 months, the quiet didn't feel like something to run from. Later, after Martha had cleared the bowls and retired to her room off the kitchen, Ethan walked Clara out to the porch, where the summer evening had cooled just enough to be comfortable crickets loud in the grass beyond the fence line. "You're welcome to the spare room in the bunkhouse office," he said. "Martha keeps it made up. Nobody uses it since my foreman got married and moved off to his own place. Ethan, I can't stay here. If Thorn finds out, Thorn already knows where you are. That much was plain the moment he pulled into my yard without asking for directions." He looked out at the dark line of the fence at the place where the wagons had stood that morning. "Question isn't whether they know. Question is whether you're going to keep running toward nowhere or stand somewhere long enough to see if it holds. And if it doesn't hold, if Martha loses her position, if your men get hurt, if the bank calls in a loan the moment the Mercer Company leans on them, the way they leaned on that family in Laramie, then we'll face it when it comes. But I've never yet backed down from a fight just because I was afraid of losing it, and I don't intend to start with this one." He turned to look at her fully then, and something in his gaze held a weight she hadn't expected from a man she'd known less than a day. "You said something out there today. Said you weren't a debt. I believed you the second you said it, Clara. I still believe it now." Her throat tightened, though she refused to let it show in her voice. "Nobody said that to me in 14 years. "Then it's about time somebody did." He nodded once toward the bunkhouse office. "Room's there when you want it. No obligation attached, no ledger, no debt. Just a bed and a roof for as long as you need it." "Why does that frighten me more than Thorn did?" "Because Thorn wanted to own you," Ethan said simply. "I don't want anything from you at all. Reckon that's a stranger feeling for a woman who spent her whole life being told her worth comes with a price tag." Clara stood on that porch a long while after he'd gone back inside, looking out at the dark fields, at the mule still tied near the barn, at the wagon that had carried the last of what she owned up this mountain road that morning. She thought of her mother's hands of 14 years of stitching for a ledger that never once balanced in her favor. Then she thought of Ethan Hale stepping between her and a man holding paper meant to reduce her to a line item saying it plain, "Those quilts don't belong to you." She walked to the bunkhouse office, and for the first time in 8 months of running, Clara Whitmore lay down to sleep without one ear listening for wagon wheels on the road. It did not last. Near midnight, a sound woke her. Not wheels this time, but boots on gravel. Careful, deliberate. The sound of a man trying very hard not to be heard, and failing only because Clara had spent 8 months training her ears for exactly this. She sat up in the dark, heart hammering, and heard a second set of boots join the first, moving toward the barn where her mule and wagon stood. She was at the window before she'd decided to move, watching two shapes in the moonlight, working at the wagon's canvas, and understood in an instant what they intended. If they couldn't take her by paper and threat, they'd take the last physical proof that any of this had ever been hers to begin with, burn it, or haul it off in the dark where no rancher's fair price could reach it. Clara didn't wake Ethan. She didn't think it through at all. She pulled on her boots, took the only weapon she had, an old iron poker from beside the office stove, and walked straight out into the dark toward two strangers moving against her wagon. Like the answer to 14 years of being told she had no right to anything at all, was finally going to be no. "Get away from that wagon," she said, and her voice did not shake this time, not even slightly. One of the men turned, startled, a coil of rope still in his hand, where he'd meant to lash the canvas shut before hauling the whole load off into the night. "Ma'am, you'd best go back inside. This ain't your concern anymore." "It is entirely my concern. Everything in that wagon has my mother's hands in it. Company property," the second man said, stepping toward her slow, the way a man steps toward a spooked animal he means to corner rather than calm. "Mr. Thorne said collect what's owed one way or another. Mr. Thorne can collect it himself in daylight in front of witnesses, the way an honest man settles a debt, not two men creeping around another man's barn at midnight like thieves." Clara's grip tightened on the poker, and something in her that had spent 14 years learning to make itself small simply refused to bend one more time. "Leave the wagon." The rope man laughed, short and certain, the way a man laughs when he's seen this outcome play out before and never once doubted it. He took another step. That was when Ethan hit the yard at a dead run, shouting her name into the dark, and the certainty on the man's face broke apart like a window taking a stone. "Clara, I'm here," she called back, not moving 1 inch from where she stood between two strangers, and the only proof left that 14 years of her life had produced something worth calling her own. The second man swore under his breath, already backing toward a saddled horse waiting in the shadows, clearly meant for a retreat that hadn't accounted for a rancher covering the distance from porch to barn faster than his size should allow. "Come on," he hissed. "Ain't worth a bullet." "Wasn't planning on using one," Ethan said, arriving breathless, placing himself beside Clara rather than in front of her shoulder to shoulder. "But I'd surely enjoy an excuse." The rope man dropped the coil, and both were on the horse and gone within a few heartbeats, hoofbeats fading down the same road the wagons had rolled up that morning until the night swallowed the sound whole. Ethan turned to her, and in the moonlight, his face had none of the calm from that afternoon, only something raw. "You could have woken me." "There wasn't time." "There's always time to wake a man sleeping 30 yards away. I wasn't going to stand at a window and watch them take the last thing I have left while I waited on somebody else to save it for me." She was shaking now, the poker still clenched in her fist. "I've watched things taken from me my whole life because somebody decided it was theirs to take. I am done standing at windows." Ethan reached out slow and closed his hand over hers on the poker's handle until her fingers loosened enough for him to set it aside. "Then you won't stand at windows. But you'll wake me next time because two of us facing them down beats one, and I'd rather you know that now than after somebody gets hurt proving it. You came anyway. Always will." The word settled over her heavier than it had any right to, given they'd known each other less than a full day, and Clara found she didn't have it in her to argue with it. Not tonight, not with her wagon still standing whole, because she had refused one more time to let it be taken. She looked at the rope discarded in the dirt and understood with a clarity that settled deep in her chest that Thorne's men had not come to frighten her into obedience. They had come to test how much this ranch was willing to lose to keep her. Tonight, they had gotten their answer. Morning came gray and slow, the kind of gray that made the whole ranch look like it was still deciding whether to believe last night had happened at all. Clara hadn't slept again after the men fled. Not really just lain on the cot in the bunkhouse office with the poker still within reach of her hand, listening to every creak of the building settling around her like it might be boots on gravel instead. She found Ethan already in the yard when she came out, crouched beside the wagon wheel, running his fingers along a groove cut fresh into the wood where the rope had been tied the night before. "They meant to drag the whole wagon off the axle," he said without looking up. Rope like that don't get used for tying down canvas. I know. You should have told me that last night. I was a little occupied not getting my throat cut, Ethan. That got him to look up, and something in his face cracked just slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Clara felt her own shoulders loosen for the first time since the sun had come up. Fair, he admitted. Come eat. Martha's been up since 4 and she gets meaner by the hour when nobody shows for breakfast. Inside the kitchen was warm, with the smell of biscuits, and Martha set a plate in front of Clara, without a word, though her eyes lingered a beat longer than usual, taking inventory the way a mother counts fingers on a child who's been in a fall. You're pale, Martha said. I'm tired. Tired's an excuse. Pale is what happens when a body's been scared half to death and hasn't caught back up yet. Martha set down a second biscuit, even though Clara hadn't finished the first. Eat anyway. Ethan sat across from her, and for a while the only sound was the scrape of forks and the crackle of the stove until he finally set his fork down and said what Clara suspected he'd been turning over since sunrise. I'm sending Tom into Willow Creek this morning. Who's Tom? My foreman. Good man, been with me 6 years. I want him talking to the marshal about what happened here last night, and I want it on record before Thorne gets a chance to file something first and make us out to be the ones in the wrong. He'll deny it happened. Then he'll deny it in front of a marshal instead of just to us, and that's worth something. Ethan leaned back. But that's not the only reason I'm sending him. What else? I want to know what Thorne's next move looks like before he makes it. A man like that showing up with lawyers instead of just hired guns means he's already thought 3 steps past where we're standing. I aim to know at least one of those steps before he takes it. Clara set her own fork down slower than she meant to, her appetite souring at the reminder that this wasn't over, that it had barely even started. You're spending money and men on my behalf, Ethan. Money and men that have nothing to do with this fight until I walked it up your road yesterday morning. They've got everything to do with it now. That's how it works when a man decides something's worth standing for. He said it plain, no heat in it, the same way he'd said everything else since she'd met him. And Clara found herself believing it, despite 14 years of training that told her nothing came free, that every kindness had a ledger line waiting behind it somewhere. What do you want in return? She asked, quieter than she meant to. Ethan's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something that looked almost like hurt. Nothing, Clara. I already told you that. Everybody wants something. Then I reckon I'm the first exception you've met. He stood, taking his plate to the basin himself, rather than leaving it for Martha, a small gesture that Clara noticed more than she expected to. Tom's saddling up. I'm going to walk the fence line, make sure nobody left anything behind last night worth finding. You're welcome to stay in the house today. Door locks from the inside. I'd rather not sit inside waiting to see what happens. Didn't figure you would. He almost smiled again. There's a mending pile in the front room if idle hands trouble you as much as they trouble me. Martha will show you. The morning passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Clara's hands busy with someone else's torn shirts and loose buttons, while her mind kept circling back to the wagons, to Thorne's cold certainty, to the man who'd dropped the rope in the dirt, and looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, rather than a person standing in front of him. Martha worked beside her, humming low under her breath, and somewhere around mid-morning, she finally spoke what had clearly been sitting on her tongue since breakfast. You ought to know something about this ranch before you get too comfortable staying on it. Clara looked up. What's that? Ethan doesn't fight for things easy. Takes a great deal to move that man past careful, and he's been careful 3 summers straight since Anna passed. Martha's needle paused. I haven't seen him step in front of trouble like he did yesterday since before she died. Not once. I didn't ask him to. Didn't say you did. Just saying it means something a man like that deciding a stranger's fight is worth becoming his own. Martha's eyes were kind but direct. Question is whether you're fixing to stay long enough to find out what it means, or whether you're going to run the moment it gets easier to run than to stay. The words landed harder than Clara expected because they weren't wrong, because running had become the only skill she trusted herself to be good at anymore. I don't know how to do anything else, Martha. 14 years I did what I was told, and 8 months I've done nothing but run from the consequences of finally not doing that. I don't know what staying looks like. Looks like this, Martha said, simply nodding at the mending pile at the kitchen, at the whole quiet, unremarkable morning around them. Ordinary. That's all staying ever looks like until the day it doesn't, and then you find out whether the ordinary was worth defending. Clara didn't have an answer for that, and Martha didn't seem to need one, going back to her humming like she'd said all she intended to say. Tom Bridger returned a little past noon dust on his coat, and something grim set into his face that told the story before he'd said a word. Ethan met him in the yard, Clara close enough behind to hear, though she kept back a pace, out of some instinct that this conversation belonged to the men who'd have to answer for whatever came of it. Marshall took the report, Tom said. Wrote it all down, asked good questions. But I'll tell you plain, Ethan, he didn't seem eager to go poking at the Mercer Trading Company. Man's got interests all through this territory. Marshall mentioned they hold paper on half the businesses in Willow Creek, including, if I heard him right, a chunk of the bank itself. Ethan's face didn't change, but something in his stance went rigid. The bank holding my cattle loan. Same one. That's not coincidence. Didn't say it was. Tom glanced past Ethan to Clara, apologetic in the way a man is when he's about to say something that'll land like a stone in still water. There's more. Elias Pruitt over at the bank asked after you specific. Wanted to know if you'd taken in a woman selling quilts. Wasn't subtle about it either. Somebody'd already been to see him this morning before I even got to town. Clara felt the floor of her stomach drop out from under her. Thorne. Didn't give a name, but I'd wager my saddle on it. Tom looked between them both. Ethan, if that loan comes due sudden, or if Pruitt decides he doesn't like the company you're keeping, let him decide what he likes. Ethan's voice had gone flat and hard, the same tone he'd used on Thorne the day before. I've never missed a payment on that loan in 4 years. Loans don't need a missed payment to get called, not when the man holding your paper owes favors to somebody bigger than you. You know that as well as I do. The silence that followed had weight to it, and Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. This is exactly what happened in Laramie. Not violence, just doors closing one after another until there wasn't a door left to walk through. I heard you the first time you told it. Ethan said, not unkindly but firm. Doesn't change what I intend to do about it, which is nothing different than what I already decided yesterday. Ethan, if they take your ranch, they won't. He said it with a certainty Clara wanted desperately to believe and couldn't quite manage. But I appreciate you worrying on my behalf instead of just your own. That's new for you, I'd guess. Ethan didn't have an answer for that either, and the moment stretched until Tom cleared his throat, uncomfortable in the way of a man standing in the middle of something private he hadn't meant to witness. There's one more thing, Tom said. Marshall asked me to pass along a name. Fella by the name of Garrett Thorne filed a formal claim this morning, first thing before the office even opened proper. Claim states Ethan Hale is knowingly harboring a woman under active indenture and receiving stolen company property, namely 11 handmade quilts with intent to resell for profit. That's a lie, Clara said sharper than she meant to. Don't have to be true to cost you something, Tom said gently. Just has to be filed. Marshall's required to look into it now whether he wants to or not. Ethan exhaled slow through his nose, the first real crack of frustration Clara had seen in him since yesterday morning. When's he coming out here? Said tomorrow, most likely. Wanted to give you fair warning instead of showing up cold. Decent of him. Marshall Coyle's a decent man, far as territorial marshals go. Doesn't mean he can ignore a filed claim, decent or not. Word of the filed claim moved through the bunkhouse faster than Ethan had likely intended, and by the time the men came in for their noon meal, Clara could feel the weight of their eyes on her, some curious, some wary one, openly hostile. That one belonged to a lean, sun-cracked hand named Wyatt Doss, who set his plate down hard enough to rattle the table and didn't bother lowering his voice. "Boss, can I speak plain? You generally do, Wyatt invited or not." Ethan didn't look up from his own plate. Word's already halfway to town that you're harboring a runaway indenture and picking fights with a company that's got half this territory's banks in its pocket. Some of us got families depending on wages from this outfit. I'd like to know if those wages are still coming, or if we're all fixing to go down with this particular ship on account of a woman none of us knew existed 3 days ago." The room went quiet, forks stilled, and Clara felt her face go hot with a shame that had nothing to do with anything she'd actually done wrong, and everything to do with a lifetime of being made to feel like a burden for simply existing where she wasn't wanted. "Wyatt," Martha's voice cut sharp from the stove. "Mind your tone." "I'm asking a fair question, Martha. Man's got a right to know if his job's in danger. Your wages are safe," Ethan said, still calm, though something had gone taut in his jaw. "This ranch has weathered worse than one company's lawyers, and it'll weather this too. With respect, boss, you don't know that. Nobody knows that. You're betting the whole outfit on a woman you met 2 days back, and some of us got children counting on this place staying standing." Clara set down her own fork, her appetite gone entirely. "He's not wrong to ask," she said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward her, surprised she'd spoken at all. "I never meant to put anybody's wages or family at risk. If it comes to that, Wyatt, I'll be the first one gone." "Clara." Ethan's voice held a warning in it, low and firm. "I mean it. This is his ranch, his men, his years of work. I won't be the reason any of that falls apart because I couldn't bring myself to keep running." She looked at Wyatt, directly refusing to let her voice shake. "You've got every right to be afraid for your family. I understand that better than you might think." Wyatt held her gaze a long moment, something in his hard expression softening just slightly, though not entirely. "Don't need you to understand it, ma'am. Need to know it ain't going to cost me my livelihood." "It won't," Ethan said final this time. The kind of final that ended arguments whether the other party was satisfied or not. "I've made my decision, Wyatt. You're welcome to voice concerns, and I'll hear them same as I heard this one, but the decision stands. Anybody who can't work under it is free to draw their wages and go, no hard feelings, no bad words said on their way out." Nobody moved. Wyatt's jaw worked like he had more to say, and thought better of it, finally picking his fork back up with a tight nod that wasn't quite agreement but wasn't defiance either. Later, once the men had scattered back to their afternoon work, Clara found Martha alone in the kitchen, and finally asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since Wyatt's outburst. "Is he right to worry, Martha, truly?" Martha considered the question longer than Clara expected before answering. "Wyatt's got 3 little ones and a wife who took in laundry to make ends meet before he got steady work here. His worry ain't cruelty, child. It's just fear wearing a rude coat, same as most fear does when it's got nowhere better to go." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Doesn't mean Ethan's wrong either. Sometimes a man's got to choose between what's safe and what's right, and this ranch has been safe a long while now. Maybe too long." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Ethan Hale stopped taking risks the day Anna died, on account of risk being what took her from him in the first place, or so he's convinced himself. Doctor came late because the roads were bad, and Ethan wouldn't risk the horses in a storm to fetch him faster. He's carried that a long time, blaming caution for a fever. No doctor could have beaten regardless." Martha's eyes went distant, remembering. "You showed up in his yard, and he took a risk for the first time in 3 years. I don't think that's about you being worth it, though you are. I think it's about him finally being ready to risk something again." Clara turned that over in her mind the rest of the afternoon, and she understood with a clarity that unsettled her that this fight had become about far more than 11 quilts and a company ledger. It had become somehow about whether a grieving man could learn to stand in the open again without flinching. That evening, after Tom had ridden back out to check the herd, and Martha had retired early with a headache Clara suspected was worry, dressed up as something more ordinary. Clara found Ethan alone on the porch, staring out at the same dark fence line where the confrontation had happened the night before. "You're not sleeping either," she said, settling into the chair beside him without asking permission. Something that would have been unthinkable to her a week ago, back when every space she occupied had to be earned or apologized for. Not much point trying. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull away either. "Keep running the numbers on that loan in my head. 4 years of payments, never missed one, and it still comes down to whether a banker likes the company I'm keeping better than he likes the money I owe him. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing for existing, Clara. I've noticed you do that. Every time something goes wrong near you, you say sorry, like it's your fault the world's got teeth. The observation hit harder than she expected, mostly because it was true, and mostly because nobody had ever said it to her plain like that before, without cruelty, just fact laid bare the way Ethan seemed to lay most things bare. 14 years of being told everything I did wrong cost the company money will do that to a person. I imagine it will. He finally turned to look at her. For what it's worth, nothing you've done has cost me anything I wasn't willing to spend, even if it cost you the ranch. Even then. His voice didn't waver on it, and something about the steadiness of it frightened her more than Thorne's threats had, because threats she knew how to survive. She'd had 14 years of practice surviving threats. She had no practice at all surviving a man who meant what he said with that much quiet certainty. Why me? She asked. Out of everyone, Thorne could have gone after everyone who's ever run from that company. Why does it feel like you'd have done this for anybody standing in your yard yesterday? Maybe I would have. He considered it honestly, not rushing to flatter her with an answer that wasn't true. But I don't think so. I think it was the way you held that quilt, like it was the only thing standing between you and disappearing altogether. I recognized that grip, Clara. Held onto Anna's shawl the same way for the better part of a year after she passed, like letting go of the fabric meant letting go of the last proof she'd ever existed at all. Clara felt her throat tighten, and this time she didn't try to hide it. I'm sorry about Anna. Don't be sorry. Just understand why I wasn't about to stand in my own yard and watch a man in a fine coat tell you that the only proof of who you are and what you've survived wasn't yours to keep. He looked back out at the dark. Some fights aren't really about quilts, Clara. Some fights are about whether a person's allowed to hold on to the one thing that proves they're still themselves. They sat with that a long while, the crickets loud around them, the night settling into something almost peaceful despite everything hanging over it, until Clara finally broke the silence with the question that had been circling her mind since Tom's report that afternoon. Ethan, if the marshal comes tomorrow and Thorne's there too, what do we say? We say the truth. You left an indenture no 14-year-old should have ever been made to sign, and you've been running from men who'd rather see you disappear than let a marshal look too closely at how that indenture was written in the first place. And if that's not enough, then we find something that is. He stood offering her a hand up from the chair, and she took it without hesitation. This time, the calluses on his palm rough against hers, a working man's hands meeting a seamstress's hands, two different kinds of labor that had both in their own ways been undervalued by men who never once had to earn a callus themselves. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to test both of us. Clara didn't sleep, not really, but she lay in the dark of the bunkhouse office with something new sitting alongside the fear. Something she hadn't let herself feel in 8 months of running. Something dangerously close to the belief that maybe for the first time she wasn't standing alone against the wagons rolling up the road. Marshal Coyle arrived a little after 9 the next morning, a broad-weathered man with a badge pinned crooked, and a manner that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else doing anything other than standing between a rancher and a trading company with lawyers in 3 territories. Thorne arrived 20 minutes behind him, alone this time, no enforcers fanning out along the fence, just the man himself, and the same folded paper from 2 days before now, joined by several others. Marshal, Ethan said, stepping onto the porch with Clara, a half step behind him, close enough to be present, far enough back to let him lead as he clearly intended to. Mr. Hale. Miss Whitmore, I presume. Coyle tipped his hat, an old habit that seemed to surprise even him given the circumstances. I'll be straight with you both. I've got a filed claim here alleging theft of company property and harboring of an indentured worker under active contract. I'm obligated to hear both sides before I decide whether there's cause to take this further. There's no cause, Ethan said. I bought 11 quilts fair and square, paid in coin hand to hand in front of witnesses. That's not theft. That's commerce. The commerce is irrelevant, Thorne interjected, stepping forward with the paper already extended. The property in question was manufactured using patterns and materials belonging to the Mercer Trading Company under an active indenture contract signed by Miss Whitmore at age 14. Everything she produces, whether sold to Mr. Hale or anyone else, remains company property until that debt is satisfied. Marshall Coyle took the paper, reading slow, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. This indenture says here it was signed by a minor, with her mother's consent prior to the mother's passing, and after the mother passed, the debt transferred as is standard in company practice. Standard company practice, Coyle repeated, and something in his tone suggested he didn't much care for the phrase. Mr. Thorne, I've been marshal in this territory 11 years. I've seen indentures before, never seen one that claimed a person's labor in perpetuity with no defined end, no fixed sum, and no path to satisfaction other than the company's own say-so. The sum is calculated against expenses incurred, Marshal. Lodging, materials, training. It is not arbitrary. Calculated by who? By the company's accounting office. So the same party owed the debt is the same party who decides how large that debt is, with no outside party ever reviewing the math. Coyle's mouth twisted, unimpressed. Mr. Thorne, where I come from, we've got a word for an arrangement like that, and it isn't commerce. Thorne's composure flickered just slightly, the first crack Clara had seen in him since he'd first stepped down from his wagon 2 days ago. The terms are standard for artisan training contracts. Standard don't make it lawful. Coyle looked to Clara directly for the first time. Miss Whitmore, do you have a copy of this indenture in your possession? No. The company kept the original. I was never given a copy of my own contract to review. That true, Mr. Thorne. Company policy is to retain original documents for security purposes. Convenient policy. Coyle folded the paper back up slower than he'd unfolded it. Here's where I land on this, and I want both of you to hear it plain, so there's no confusion later. I can't rule on the validity of a contract I haven't seen in full, and neither can any judge in this territory without the actual document in hand. Until such time as Mr. Thorne produces the original indenture for review, I've got no lawful basis to compel Miss Whitmore to do anything, nor to charge Mr. Hale with theft of property whose ownership remains in dispute. Thorne's jaw tightened visibly. Marshal, this is a matter for territorial courts, not a rancher's front porch. Then take it to territorial court and bring the document. Until you do, I've got no cause here today. Coyle handed the paper back, and something in the gesture felt almost final, though Clara knew better than to believe Thorne would let it stay that way. Mr. Hale, Miss Whitmore, I apologize for the trouble. Mr. Thorne, I'd advise you to think carefully before filing another claim you can't back up with paper. Makes a man look desperate filing things he can't prove. I'll have that document within the week, Thorne said, his voice low and cold, aimed less at the marshal now and more directly at Clara. And when I do, Marshal, I expect this territory's courts to honor a lawful contract, regardless of how sympathetic the circumstances might appear on a rancher's porch. When you do, bring it to my office, and we'll discuss it proper. Coyle mounted back up, tipping his hat once more to Clara, an oddly gentle gesture in the middle of so much cold calculation. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Hale. He rode out without further ceremony, leaving Thorne standing alone in the yard with his unproven paper and his composure visibly fraying at the edges. You think this is finished, Thorne said quietly to both of them, and neither of them at once. It isn't. That document exists, Mr. Hale, and when I return with it, no marshal's sympathy is going to matter one bit against a properly executed contract. Then I look forward to seeing it, Ethan said. In the meantime, you're on my land without invitation. I'd appreciate you correcting that. Thorne held Ethan's gaze a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes that made Clara's skin prickle despite the summer heat. You've made an enemy today, Mr. Hale, over a woman who ran from a debt she legally owes. I hope she's worth it. She is, Ethan said without hesitation, without a moment's pause to consider whether the answer might cost him something. More than you'll ever understand, standing where you're standing. Thorne's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, climbed into his wagon and left the same way he'd come, dust rising behind him in a column that took a long while to settle. Clara stood very still in the yard long after the sound of wheels had faded, her chest tight, with something that felt almost like relief and almost like dread in equal measure, because Thorne hadn't left defeated. He'd left recalculating, and men like that, she knew from 14 years of watching them operate, only ever recalculated toward something worse. "He's going to find that document," she said quietly. "Maybe." Ethan came to stand beside her close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "Or maybe he's going to find that a 14-year-old's signature on a piece of paper written by grown men to trap her doesn't mean what he thinks it means once an actual judge looks at it in daylight. You don't know territorial law well enough to promise that." "No. But I know a man desperate enough to threaten a marshal to his face is a man who already suspects his own paper might not hold up the way he needs it to." Ethan turned to face her fully. "That fear you saw crack through him just now, right before he climbed back in that wagon. That's the first real thing he's shown us since he arrived. Everything else has been performance. That crack was true." Clara wanted to believe him. Wanted it badly enough that she let herself, just for the length of that afternoon, set down some of the weight she'd been carrying since the moment she'd first heard 3 sets of wagon wheels coming up a road that was supposed to lead somewhere safe. But that night, long after the house had gone quiet, and Clara had finally drifted into something like real sleep, for the first time in days, she woke to the sound of Martha's voice, sharp and urgent, calling Ethan's name from somewhere near the kitchen, and beneath it, fainter, the unmistakable crackle and orange glow of fire. Clara was on her feet before she'd fully understood the sound. Bare feet hitting the cold floor of the bunkhouse office, Martha's voice cutting through the dark like a blade. She burst out the door to find the barn's east wall already lit orange flames, climbing fast along dry timber that hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks, and Ethan already sprinting across the yard in nothing but his union suit and boots, shouting orders that scattered men out of the bunkhouse like buckshot. "Waterline now. Tom, get the stock out. Wyatt, buckets." Clara didn't think. She ran straight for the barn's side door, the one nearest where her wagon had been moved 2 nights before for safekeeping. Because the only thought her body allowed her was that fire didn't care about company ledgers or legal claims. Fire simply took, and she would not stand at another window and watch something taken. "Clara? No!" Ethan's voice tore after her, but she was already inside smoke, thick and stinging, the mule screaming somewhere in its stall, and she found the latch on its own by memory alone. Hands shaking, throat burning, dragging the animal free by its halter as the fire crackled louder behind her. The wagon sat 20 feet further in canvas, already smoldering at one corner. "Clara!" Ethan was beside her now, hauling the mule's lead from her hands and shoving it toward the door where Tom waited to take it. "The wagon isn't worth your life." "It isn't the wagon." She was already at the tailgate, yanking canvas back, coughing hard, her eyes streaming. "It's everything left of who I was before any of this." He didn't argue further. He grabbed the opposite end of the load, and together they hauled the bundled quilts free in one desperate motion, stumbling backward through smoke and heat until they broke into open air, both of them collapsing to their knees in the dirt. The quilts, scorched at one edge but whole, saved still theirs. Behind them, the barn's east wall groaned and gave way, a section of roof collapsing inward in a shower of sparks that lit the whole yard. Orange, and every man on the ranch worked the water line in a chain from the well buckets, passing hand to hand until the flames finally began to choke and die. Sometime past 2 in the morning, leaving behind a smoking, half-collapsed skeleton where a barn had stood that afternoon, Clara sat in the dirt long after the danger passed, coughing smoke from her lungs. The rescued quilts clutched against her chest exactly the way they had been the morning Thorne first arrived, and she understood with a sick, sinking certainty that this had not been an accident of dry timber and bad luck. "Lamp oil," Tom said grimly, crouching near the barn's ruined east wall, once the embers had cooled enough to approach. He held up a shattered glass container, the smell of coal oil still sharp even through the char. "Somebody poured this along the base of the wall before it caught. Barn fires don't start at the bottom of an outside wall on their own, Ethan. Somebody set this." Ethan's face, already streaked with soot and exhaustion, went hard in a way Clara hadn't seen from him yet, not even facing Thorne. Who was on watch tonight? Silas, Tom said, and something in his voice already carried the answer before he finished the thought. New hand. Hired him on 8 days back, right before Miss Whitmore ever came up the road. Where is he now? Tom didn't need to search long to confirm what all of them had already begun to suspect. Silas Rourke's bunk sat empty. His few belongings gone, his horse missing from the corral, and wagon tracks led away from the ranch toward Willow Creek fresh enough that they hadn't yet been erased by the night's confusion. He's been feeding information, Ethan said quietly, staring at the empty bunk. 8 days. Long enough to know the wagon's location, long enough to know the ranch's layout, long enough to report every move we made back to Thorne before we ever made it. Wyatt Doss stood near the doorway, his own hands blistered from the water line, his earlier hostility toward Clara nowhere in his face, now replaced by something more like shame. I owe you an apology, ma'am. Was ready to blame this whole mess on you showing up here, and turns out the real danger was a man Ethan hired on his own, nothing to do with you at all. You weren't wrong to worry, Wyatt, Clara said, too tired to hold on to any grudge. You just aimed it at the wrong target. Don't make it right what I said. No, but it makes it human. She managed something close to a smile, despite the ash still stinging her eyes. I understand fear better than most people you'll meet. Ethan straightened, surveying the ruined barn, with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. We lost feed stores, tack half the winter's hay. That's weeks of work and money gone in one night on top of a bank that already had reason to look for an excuse. You think Thorne ordered this? Clara asked. I think a man who hires spies doesn't stop at watching, Ethan said. I think tonight was a message, and tomorrow there'll be another one waiting behind it. He was right. The message arrived before noon, carried not by Thorne himself, but by a nervous young clerk from the Willow Creek Bank who handed Ethan a sealed letter with visibly shaking hands and left without waiting to see it opened. Ethan read it standing in the yard, the ruined barn smoking faintly behind him, and Clara watched his jaw tighten with each line until he finally lowered the paper, his face gone the color of ash. They're calling the loan, he said, in full. 10 days. Ethan, 4 years of payments, never missed one, and Pruitt's calling the whole balance due in 10 days on account of, and I quote, irregularities in the borrower's current associations. He crumpled the letter in one fist, then seemed to catch himself smoothing it back out instead, because a crumpled letter wouldn't undo a called loan any more than his anger would. 10 days, Clara. I don't have that kind of money sitting in a strongbox. Nobody does, not for cattle loans this size. This is my fault. Don't. It is Ethan. The fire, the loan, all of it traces back to the moment I walked my wagon up your road. Wyatt was right 3 days ago, whether either of us wanted to hear it. I've cost you your barn, your feed stores, and now I'm about to cost you your whole ranch. You didn't set that fire. You didn't call that loan. A man with more money than conscience did both of those things, and I'll be damned if I let you carry guilt that belongs entirely to him. Ethan's voice had risen for the first time since she'd known him, not at her, but at the unfairness of the accusation she'd leveled against herself. Stop taking on debts that aren't yours, Clara. That's exactly the trap Thorne's been running on you for 14 years, and I won't watch you build the same cage around yourself out of guilt instead of paper. Clara flinched at the truth of it, because he wasn't wrong, because some old worn groove in her mind had already started calculating what she owed him, what price her presence had cost, exactly the way the Mercer ledger had once calculated every yard of thread against a debt that never shrank. Then what do we do? She asked quieter. We fight it. 10 days is enough time to talk to a lawyer in the territorial capital, enough time to find out whether a bank can legally call a loan in good standing just because its owner made an enemy of the wrong company. Ethan looked at the letter again, then at the ruined barn, then back at her. And we rebuild what we lost, because giving Thorne the satisfaction of watching this place fall apart isn't an option I'm willing to consider. Tom approached from across the yard, his face carrying yet another piece of news that Clara could tell before he spoke wasn't going to make the day any easier. Riders coming up the road, Ethan. 3 of them. Recognize the lead horse. It's Thorne. Clara's stomach dropped the fire, and the loan notice suddenly feeling like separate movements building toward the same crescendo, and she found herself standing straighter despite the exhaustion in every limb, because whatever Thorne intended to say next, she refused to hear it from her knees. He arrived without enforcers this time, just two clerks trailing behind him. One of them carrying a leather satchel clutched against his chest like it held something precious, and Thorne's expression carried none of the cold amusement from his previous visits. He looked, Clara thought, like a man arriving to collect on a bet he was fully confident he'd already won. "Mr. Hale, Miss Whitmore." He glanced once at the smoking ruin of the barn, and something in his mouth twitched, not quite satisfaction, but close enough to it that Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I understand you've had some misfortune." "Misfortune?" Ethan repeated flatly. "That's an interesting word for arson. I wouldn't know anything about that." Thorne's tone made clear he expected no one to believe him, and didn't much care whether they did. "I've come with the document Marshal Coyle requested. The original indenture signed by Miss Whitmore's mother, witnessed and notarized in full accordance with territorial law." He gestured, and the clerk produced the satchel, withdrawing a yellowed document that Thorne unfolded with theatrical care and held out not to Ethan this time, but directly to Clara. "I thought you should see your mother's signature yourself, Miss Whitmore, before this goes any further. Some things are harder to deny once you've seen the proof in your own hands." Clara took the paper with fingers that didn't want to cooperate, scanning down through dense legal language, until she found it a looping signature at the bottom of the page, her mother's name, written in flowing script. Her breath caught, and not for the reason Thorne clearly expected. "This isn't her signature," Clara said. Thorne's composure flickered. "Excuse me, this isn't my mother's signature." Clara's voice grew steadier with each word, something fierce igniting behind her eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. "My mother couldn't write her own name in cursive, Mr. Thorne. She learned her letters late in life from me after I'd already been taught by the company schoolteacher. She signed everything in block print, slow, careful, like a child still learning the shapes. I have letters from her. I have the inside cover of her Bible where she wrote our names the year we arrived at the company works. I know exactly what her signature looks like. And this—" She thrust the paper back toward him, her hand no longer shaking with fear, but with fury. "This is not it." The clerk holding the satchel went very still. Thorne's jaw tightened, the same crack Clara had seen at the marshal's visit, except wider this time, harder to disguise. "You're mistaken," Thorne said, but the words came out clipped, rushed, missing the smooth certainty he'd carried into every previous confrontation. "Am I—" Clara turned to Ethan. "I have her Bible in my wagon, what's left of it after the fire. I can show you her actual signature, and you can compare it to this yourself. I'll get it," Ethan said, already moving toward the salvaged wagon, and Thorne made no move to stop him, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how confident the man actually was in the paper he'd just presented as unimpeachable proof. Ethan returned within minutes carrying a small scorched Bible, its cover singed, but the pages inside miraculously intact. He opened it to the inside front cover, where two names had been written in blocky, careful letters, clearly the work of a hand still uncertain of itself on a page. Margaret Whitmore. Clara Whitmore. The contrast against the flowing signature on Thorne's indenture was immediate and undeniable, plain enough that even Tom, standing several feet back, let out a low whistle of disbelief. "That's not the same hand," Ethan said, holding both documents side by side. "Not even close. Any judge in this territory is going to see that in about 4 seconds, Thorne and I imagine he's going to ask some very pointed questions about how a forged signature ended up on a legally binding indenture your company's been using to hunt this woman across 3 counties. Thorne's face had gone pale beneath his composure the first time Clara had seen him look genuinely rattled rather than merely inconvenienced. "The company's legal department handles document authentication. If there's an irregularity—" "There's not an irregularity," Clara said, her voice cutting clean through his excuse. There's a forgery. My mother never signed that indenture, Mr. Thorne, which means whatever debt you've spent 14 years telling me I owed was built on a lie from the very first page. That doesn't erase your own signature at 14, Thorne said, recovering some of his composure, grasping for the one piece of ground that still held. You signed that renewal yourself. Under duress as a child, told my mother's debt would fall on me. Regardless, coerced by men who'd already forged her signature once, and clearly had no scruples about doing it again. Clara felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear, and absolutely certain for the first time since Thorne had first climbed down from his wagon. I don't think any judge is going to look kindly on a company that builds its entire claim on a foundation of forged paperwork, do you? Thorne said nothing for a long moment, his eyes moving between the two documents, between Clara's steady, furious face and Ethan's grim satisfaction, calculating something Clara couldn't quite read. This changes nothing about the immediate situation, he said finally, though the conviction had drained from his voice. The company will contest the authenticity claim, and until a court rules, otherwise the original terms remain in effect. Then contest it, Ethan said, in front of a judge with both documents on the table, and let's see how well that argument holds up next to a mother's actual handwriting in her own daughter's Bible. Thorne folded the false indenture back into the satchel with hands that weren't quite as steady as they'd been an hour before. You've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be, Miss Whitmore. No, Clara said. You made it complicated the day you forged a dead woman's signature to steal 14 years of her daughter's life. I've simply stopped letting you get away with it. He left without another word, the two clerks trailing behind him. And this time there was no parting threat, no cold promise of further paperwork, just the quiet, furious retreat of a man who had walked in certain of victory and left considerably less sure of anything at all. Clara stood in the yard holding her mother's scorched Bible, her hands finally steady, and felt something shift inside her chest, that she hadn't expected, something that felt less like relief and more like grief, finally given somewhere honest to land. She never signed it, Clara said quietly, mostly to herself. 14 years, and she never actually signed away anything. It was a lie from the very beginning, which means it can be broken. Ethan said close beside her, properly legally, in a way that ends this for good, instead of just delaying it. If the court believes us over a company with lawyers in 3 territories, they will once they see this Bible next to that indenture. Handwriting like that doesn't lie the way men do. He looked at her carefully. Are you all right? I don't know, Clara admitted. I spent 14 years believing I owed something I never actually owed at all. I don't know what to do with that feeling, Ethan. I don't know if it's supposed to feel like freedom or like grief. Maybe both for a while. He didn't try to talk her out of the complexity of it, and she found herself grateful for that, more than she could easily put into words. Come inside. Martha's got coffee on, and we've still got a loan to figure out how to fight forgery or not. The 10-day deadline hung over the ranch like a held breath through the following days, the men working double shifts to salvage what timber they could from the barn, while Ethan rode into Willow Creek twice to consult with the one lawyer in town, willing to take on a case against the Mercer Trading Company. A nervous but sharp young attorney named Amos Reed, who seemed equal parts terrified and thrilled at the prospect of the fight in front of him. The forgery changes everything, Reed told them on the second visit, spreading both documents across his desk with the same reverence a man might show Holy Scripture. If we can prove this signature is false, and I believe we can, the entire indenture collapses along with any claim the company has to Miss Whitmore's labor, past, present, or future. More than that, it opens the company to charges of fraud, which is precisely the kind of leverage we need against a bank that's suddenly decided your loan constitutes an emergency. How long before we can get in front of a judge? Ethan asked. Circuit judge comes through in 11 days. 1 day past your bank's deadline, unfortunately, which means we need Pruitt to grant an extension in the meantime. And bankers don't typically grant extensions to men they suspect of harboring fugitive debtors. What happens if he refuses the extension? Clara asked. Reed hesitated, clearly reluctant to lay it out plain, then did so anyway, because the alternative was letting them walk into it blind. Then the bank forecloses in 10 days, regardless of what the circuit judge eventually rules about the forgery. A ranch this size doesn't move through a foreclosure quiet or slow, Mr. Hale. Cattle get seized as collateral land gets auctioned, and even if you win the forgery case a month later, you'd be winning it as a man with no ranch left to protect. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. Then we make sure Pruitt grants the extension. He'll want a reason beyond sympathy, Reed said. Bankers don't reverse decisions on sentiment. You'll need to give him something concrete enough that refusing looks worse to his own board than granting it would. He'll grant it if I go talk to him myself. Clara said, the decision settling in her before she'd fully thought it through. Show him the Bible. Show him the forgery. Let him see for himself that I'm not what Thorne's been telling him I am. Clara, that's a risk, Ethan said. If Pruitt's already decided which side of this he's on, then I'll find out for certain instead of hiding here and letting the decision get made without me in the room. She met his eyes steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. I spent 14 years letting other people decide what my life was worth. I'm done doing that, Ethan, even when it's frightening. Especially when it's frightening. He studied her a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from concern into something that looked almost like pride, though he didn't say so outright. All right, but you're not going alone. They rode into Willow Creek together the following morning, the scorched Bible wrapped carefully in cloth on Clara's lap, and found Elias Pruitt in his office behind the bank's main counter, a thin, nervous man, who clearly hadn't expected the confrontation currently walking through his door. Mr. Hale, this is highly irregular. So is calling a 4-year loan in good standing on 10 days' notice over rumors, Mr. Pruitt. Ethan's voice carried none of its usual patience. This is Clara Whitmore. I believe you've heard a great deal about her from a man who forged a dead woman's signature to build a fraudulent claim against her. I'd like you to hear the truth from her directly before you decide my ranch isn't worth the risk of your continued business. Pruitt's eyes moved nervously between them, and Clara stepped forward before he could retreat further into whatever excuse he'd already prepared. Mr. Pruitt, I know Garrett Thorne came to see you before this loan was called. I know he told you a story designed to make Ethan Hale look like a man harboring stolen property and defying the law. I'm asking you to look at this instead. She unwrapped the Bible, opening it to the names written inside, then set the false indenture beside it, the contrast as stark in Pruitt's office as it had been in Ethan's yard. That is my mother's actual signature. That is the forgery the Mercer Trading Company built an entire indenture upon. I am not stolen property, Mr. Pruitt. I am a woman who was lied about, lied to, and nearly destroyed by a company whose word you've apparently taken over the word of a rancher who's paid you faithfully for 4 straight years. Pruitt studied both documents for a long, silent moment, his composure visibly cracking under the weight of evidence he clearly hadn't expected to see laid out so plainly. I did not know about a forgery. You do now, Ethan said. Question is, what you intend to do with that knowledge. Pruitt was quiet a moment longer, then finally exhaled some of the nervous tension draining from his shoulders. I'll extend the loan pending the circuit judge's ruling. 14 days, not 10. That's the most I can justify to my board, without it looking like I'm simply reversing myself out of embarrassment, though I suppose that's exactly what I'd be doing. 14 days is enough, Ethan said, relief evident in his voice for the first time since the letter had arrived. It had better be, Pruitt said, because I won't be able to extend it further, not with the pressure I'm under from certain parties who I now understand may have been considerably less honest with me than I assumed. They rode back toward the ranch in a quiet that felt for the first time in days almost peaceful, the late afternoon sun warm on Clara's shoulders instead of threatening. And somewhere along that stretch of road, Ethan finally spoke what Clara could tell had been sitting behind his silence since they'd left the bank. Reed mentioned something else back at his office. Said it in passing, almost like he didn't want to be the one to bring it up. What's that? Said a married woman's assets and legal standing get treated different than a single woman's under territorial law. Said if you and I were married, the company would have a considerably harder time arguing. You're bound to any indenture at all, forged or not. On account of a husband's legal protections, superseding most prior contracts, a wife entered before marriage. Clara felt something in her chest go cold and tight, all at once, the warmth of the afternoon evaporating in an instant. Is that a proposal, Ethan, or a legal strategy? I don't rightly know how to answer that without it sounding wrong either way. Try. He was quiet a moment, choosing his words with the same careful weight he seemed to bring to everything. I don't want you to marry me because it solves a legal problem, Clara. That feels like exactly the kind of transaction you've spent your whole life running from. And I won't be the next man who tries to own you dressed up in kinder language than Thorne uses. Then why bring it up at all? Because Reed's not wrong about the law, and I'd be lying if I said the thought hadn't crossed my mind for reasons that have nothing to do with contracts. He glanced at her, something raw and unguarded in his face that she hadn't seen from him before, not even on the porch that first night. But I'd rather lose this fight honest than win it by asking you to trade one kind of ownership for another, even if my name on the papers would be a kinder cage than Thorne's ever was. The honesty of it should have soothed her, and some part of it did, but the old fear rose up anyway, sharp and immediate. I can't, Ethan. Not like this. Not with a bank deadline and a company forgery hanging over both our heads, deciding for us what our lives are supposed to look like. If I ever marry, I need it to be because I chose it free and clear, not because a ledger somewhere made it necessary. I understand. Do you? Because it sounds like exactly what I said dressed up as understanding. I do understand, Clara, because I watched a woman I loved get taken by a fever I couldn't outrun, no matter how fast I rode for the doctor, and I promised myself after that I'd never again make a choice about someone I cared for out of fear and urgency instead of clear-eyed certainty. I'm not offering marriage because I'm afraid of losing this fight. I'm telling you the option exists, and then I'm setting it down entirely until you're standing somewhere safe enough to decide what you actually want, free of Thorne, free of banks, free of anything except your own heart telling you the truth. Clara didn't answer that immediately, turning the words over as the ranch came back into view ahead of them, and something in her chest ached with a feeling she didn't have a clean name for. Not quite gratitude, not quite longing, something tangled between both. Thank you, she said finally, for asking honest instead of asking convenient. Didn't figure you'd accept anything less. No, she admitted. I don't suppose I would have. They reached the ranch a short while later, and Clara felt something in her chest loosen that had been coiled tight since the night of the fire, though she knew better than to mistake this small victory or this small honesty between them for the end of anything. Martha met them in the yard, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, and took one look at Clara's face before setting down whatever chore she'd been in the middle of. Something happened between you two on that ride. Nothing happened, Clara said too quickly. Didn't say something bad happened, said something happened. There's a difference, and your face is telling me which kind it was. Martha's eyes crinkled with something between amusement and sympathy. He mentioned Anna's name again, or did he finally work up the nerve to mention something closer to the future instead of the past? Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite everything else weighing on her that day. He mentioned marriage as a legal strategy against the indenture. And you turned him down. I told him I wasn't going to trade one kind of ownership for another, even a kinder one. Martha nodded slowly, unsurprised. Good answer. Wrong reason to marry a man doing it because a banker or a company forced your hand into it. But don't mistake a wrong reason for a wrong man, Clara. Those are two entirely different mistakes, and I'd hate to see you avoid the second by refusing to ever consider the first. I don't know how to tell the difference anymore. 14 years of every choice being made for me, and now I'm supposed to trust my own judgment about something as large as marriage. Nobody trusts it all at once, Martha said gentler now. You build the trusting, same as you build anything else, one honest choice at a time, until one day you look back and realize you've been making your own decisions for months without even noticing the fear had quieted down enough to let you. She squeezed Clara's arm, once brief and warm. That man just gave you an honest choice instead of a convenient one out there on that road. Man like that is worth taking your time over not running from. Clara didn't have an answer for that, and Martha, as she so often did, didn't seem to need one, turning back toward the kitchen with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd said exactly what needed saying and trusted the seed to grow on its own time. Clara carried those words with her through the rest of the afternoon, though she knew better than to let herself grow too settled in them. Thorne would not simply accept a forgery charge and walk away quietly. Men like that she'd learned across 14 years of watching them operate only ever escalated when cornered. And she suspected the true fight, the one that would decide everything, was still waiting for them somewhere just past the horizon of these 14 borrowed days. That suspicion proved accurate faster than she expected. They were barely back at the ranch, unsaddling the horses in the fading afternoon light, when Tom came running from the direction of the road, his face carrying an urgency that made Clara's stomach clench before he'd even spoken a word. "Ethan, there's men coming up the road, and this ain't Thorne with paperwork this time. 6 riders armed moving fast." Ethan's face went hard and still. The same expression Clara had seen the very first day, bracing for a storm he could see coming but couldn't yet stop. "Get the men positioned, now." Clara felt the fear return in a rush colder and sharper than anything Thorne's paperwork had managed to summon, because paperwork could be fought with lawyers and forged signatures, exposed with a mother's careful handwriting. But 6 armed riders moving fast up a dirt road at dusk spoke a language that had nothing to do with courts or ledgers at all. Ethan didn't wait for the riders to reach the yard before he was moving, calling names as he went. And men who'd spent the last 2 days rebuilding a burned barn dropped their tools and picked up rifles instead, forming a loose line across the entrance to the ranch without a single word needing to be spoken between them. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Wyatt Doss take up a position near the gate, the same man who 3 days earlier had accused her of bringing ruin down on all of them, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the rest, rifle steady in his hands. "Get inside, Clara," Ethan said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud. "No, this isn't the time to argue with me. I'm not arguing. I'm telling you, I'm not hiding behind a door while you stand out here because of me." She planted her feet in the dirt beside him, refusing to be moved. "If they've come for me, then I intend to be seen, not tucked away like something too fragile to face its own consequences." Ethan's jaw worked, and for a moment Clara thought he might argue further, but instead he simply nodded once, a small, grim acknowledgement that seemed to settle something between them, a recognition that she'd earned the right to stand where she chose. The 6 riders slowed as they approached, fanning out at the edge of the yard rather than riding straight in, and the man at their center reined up first, a broad-shouldered figure with a badge-shaped tin star pinned crooked to his vest that Clara recognized instantly as fraudulent, too cheap, and too new to belong to any real lawman. "Ethan Hale," the man called out. "Name's Cole Bragg. I've been retained to collect a debt owed to the Mercer Trading Company." "Retained by who?" Ethan called back. "Because the last time I checked, territorial marshals don't wear tin stars ordered out of a catalog, and hired collectors don't have the authority to seize anything without a court order." "Got authorization right here." Bragg produced a folded paper, holding it up, though he made no move to close the distance, and hand it over. "Court order seizing the woman Clara Whitmore as company property pending resolution of an active debt claim." "That order's worthless," Ethan said. "Marshal Coyle already ruled there's no lawful basis to compel Miss Whitmore to do anything until the original indenture's authenticated, and we've since proven that indenture's a forgery. Whatever paper you're waving around, it isn't worth the ink used to print it." Bragg's confident posture flickered just slightly, the same way Thorne's had cracked days before, and Clara understood in that instant that these men had been sent in haste, armed with bluster, rather than genuine legal standing, betting entirely on intimidation, succeeding where paperwork had already failed. "Judge, sign this personally," Bragg insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Which judge?" "Because the circuit judge for this territory isn't due through Willow Creek for another 11 days, and I doubt he rode out here in secret just to sign paper for a man wearing a fake badge." Ethan's voice carried no fear in it at all, only a hard, patient certainty that Clara found herself drawing strength from even as her own pulse hammered in her throat. "I'd wager that signature's about as real as your star, Mr. Bragg." One of the other riders shifted uneasily in his saddle, and Clara caught the look that passed between two of the 6 men, doubt creeping visibly into expressions that had arrived confident of an easy job. "Don't matter whose signature it carries," Bragg said, recovering some bravado. "We were paid to bring the woman back, and that's what we intend to do one way or another." "Then you'll have to go through every man standing in this yard first," Ethan said. "And I'd think carefully about whether Garrett Thorne's paying you enough to justify what that would cost you. Because assaulting a ranch full of armed men over a legal claim you can't even properly document is the kind of thing that ends careers and lives both, and not always in that order. We outnumber you," Bragg said, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the line of steady rifles facing him, doing arithmetic that clearly wasn't landing in his favor the way he'd hoped. "You've got 6 men who've never worked this land a day in their lives facing 11 who know every rock and fence post on it," Ethan said. "You've also got a fake badge, a fraudulent order, and no lawman within 20 miles who'd back your play if it went sideways. I'd think hard about those odds before you decide this hill's worth dying on for a man who forged a dead woman's signature to build his whole fortune." One of Bragg's men, younger than the rest, shifted visibly in his saddle, his rifle drooping just slightly as doubt crept plainly across his face. "Cole, nobody said nothing about a forgery." "Shut it, Danny. No, I want to hear this," Clara called out before she could stop herself, some old fear finally burning away entirely in the heat of the moment. "Did Mr. Thorne tell any of you the truth about what you were riding out here to do? Or did he simply pay you enough to not ask questions about a woman who spent 14 years running from a debt her own mother never actually agreed to?" The standoff held there tense and silent, except for the shuffle of horses and the low creak of leather, until Clara felt something in her chest refused to stay quiet any longer. Some fire that 14 years of forced silence had never fully managed to extinguish. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she called out, stepping half a pace ahead of Ethan, despite his sharp intake of breath beside her. "Not today, not ever again. The company you work for built its entire claim on my mother's forged signature, Mr. Bragg. I'd ask whoever's paying you whether they mentioned that particular detail before they sent 6 men out here to kidnap a woman on behalf of a fraud." "Fraud's a strong word, ma'am. It's the accurate word. Ask Garrett Thorne yourself if you can find him, though I suspect he's currently occupied trying to explain to his employer why a scandal involving a forged indenture is about to become considerably more public than the company would like." Bragg's eyes narrowed, studying her with something that looked almost like genuine uncertainty. Now a hired man, realizing he'd walked into a situation considerably more complicated than the simple debt collection he'd been promised. He glanced back at his men, found little enthusiasm reflected there, and seemed to be doing his own private arithmetic about whether this particular payday was worth the risk, currently staring back at him from a line of armed ranch hands who showed no sign of backing down. "This ain't finished," Bragg said, finally echoing the exact words Thorne had used days before, though with far less conviction behind them. "It is for today," Ethan said. "You're trespassing on my land with a fraudulent order and a fake badge, Mr. Bragg. I'd suggest you and your men ride out before I decide trespassing charges are worth the marshal's time, in addition to whatever fraud charges are already coming Thorne's way." The 6 riders held to their position a moment longer, some silent calculation passing between them, before Bragg finally wheeled his horse around with visible reluctance, muttering something to his men that Clara couldn't quite catch, and the group retreated back down the road at a pace considerably less confident than their arrival. The line of ranch hands didn't break formation until the dust had settled entirely, and only then did Clara feel her knees threaten to give out beneath her, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation draining away all at once, leaving her shaking in its wake. Ethan caught her before she fully realized she was swaying his arm coming around her shoulders, steady and sure. "You didn't have to do that." "I did, actually." Her voice came out unsteadier than she wanted. "I've spent 14 years letting other people speak for me, decide for me, negotiate my worth in rooms I wasn't even allowed to enter. I wasn't going to stand behind you while 6 armed men decided whether I was still a person or just a line item to be collected. You could have been hurt. So could you. So could every man standing in this yard, and not one of you hesitated. She looked up at him, something fierce and grateful tangled together in her chest. Why does that surprise you that I'd choose to stand too? Ethan didn't have an immediate answer, and Wyatt, approaching from his position at the gate rifle, now lowered but still in hand, spoke into the silence instead. Ma'am, for what it's worth, watching you stand out here and call that man's bluff to his face did more to convince me you belong on this ranch than anything Ethan could have said on your behalf. Thank you, Wyatt. Don't thank me yet. Still expect my wages on time, forgery scandal or not. A faint, tired smile crossed his weathered face, the first genuine warmth Clara had seen from him since her arrival. But I reckon I owe you a proper apology for that first day, and I intend to give it once my hands stop shaking enough to hold a cup of coffee steady. Martha appeared on the porch, then having watched the entire confrontation from the doorway, with a shotgun of her own held loosely but ready in her hands, a detail Clara hadn't noticed until that exact moment, and found herself deeply grateful for regardless. Everybody in one piece, Martha called. For now, Ethan answered. Then get in here, all of you. Adrenaline makes a body hungry whether it feels hungry or not, and I'll not have grown men fainting in my yard from forgetting to eat after a fright like that. The kitchen filled with the low murmur of men decompressing from what had nearly become violence. Martha moving between them with coffee and bread, and Clara found herself sitting at the long table with hands still trembling slightly, watching Ethan across the room as he spoke quietly with Tom about doubling the watch through the night ahead. It was nearly an hour later, once most of the men had scattered back to their evening chores, with the particular restless energy of people who'd stared down danger and needed something ordinary to steady themselves, that a lone rider came up the road again, this time alone, moving at an unhurried pace that immediately marked him as different from the threat that had preceded him. That's not brag, Tom said, squinting at the approaching figure. Smaller build, riding easy like a man who's got nothing to hide. The rider drew close enough to reveal himself as young, perhaps not yet 20, wearing a modest suit that marked him as some manner of clerk or messenger rather than muscle. And he dismounted at the edge of the yard, with visible nervousness, clearly having heard some version of what had transpired there less than 2 hours before. Mr. Hale, Miss Whitmore. His voice cracked slightly on the question. My name is Daniel Foster. I work as a junior clerk for the Territorial Court in the capital. I've ridden 2 days to deliver something urgent. Ethan stepped forward, cautious, but no longer bracing for violence. Something in the young man's manner too earnest and too frightened to belong to another of Thorne's schemes. What kind of urgent? Foster reached into his coat, with hands that shook slightly, withdrawing a sealed document bearing an official territorial seal. Word of the forgery allegation against the Mercer Trading Company reached the capital 3 days ago. A federal marshal happened to be reviewing unrelated complaints against the company when Marshal Coyle's report crossed his desk, and once he saw the word forgery attached to an indenture contract, he brought it directly to Judge Harmon Whitfield's attention. And, Clara asked, her heart climbing into her throat, and Judge Whitfield has moved the hearing up, considerably. He's arriving in Willow Creek in 3 days, not 11 specifically, to hear this matter before the circuit's regular schedule, on account of the forgery allegation touching on broader company practices the Territorial Court has apparently had concerns about for some time. Foster held the document out to Ethan, his relief at finally delivering his message visible in the loosening of his shoulders. The judge felt it prudent to move quickly given reports of, and I'm quoting his exact words here, sir, escalating and potentially dangerous conduct by company representatives. Ethan took the document, scanning it quickly before handing it to Clara, whose own hands trembled as she read the official language, confirming what Foster had just told them. 3 days, she said quietly. 3 days, Ethan repeated. Which means Bragg and his men showing up here with a fake badge and a fraudulent seizure order might have been the last desperate gasp of a company that already knows the walls are closing in. Or it means they intend to try again before the judge arrives, Tom said grimly, ever the voice tempering hope with caution. Cornered men don't always get more careful, Ethan. Sometimes they get more reckless. Clara felt the fear return colder this time, laced with something that hadn't been present before, a fragile, dangerous kind of hope that made the fear somehow harder to bear rather than easier. 3 days of watching every road, every wagon, wondering if the next one carries more men like Bragg. "Then we watch," Ethan said simply. "Together, all of us, the way we did today. 3 days is nothing compared to 14 years, Clara. We can hold 3 days. Foster, still standing awkwardly at the edge of the conversation, cleared his throat. "There's one more matter, sir, ma'am. Judge Whitfield specifically requested that Miss Whitmore appear with any physical evidence supporting the forgery claim. The Bible mentioned in Marshal Coyle's report specifically." "She'll have it," Ethan said. "Untouched exactly as it survived the fire that Thorne's company likely set to destroy it before it ever reached a courtroom." Foster's eyes widened slightly at that detail, clearly hearing for the first time the full scope of what had transpired at the ranch in recent days. "I'll relay that to the judge's office, sir. For what it's worth, and I probably shouldn't say this given my position, but the clerks in the Capitol have been talking. This isn't the first complaint against the Mercer Trading Company to cross Judge Whitfield's desk. Just the first one with proof solid enough to act on," he wrote out shortly after leaving behind a document that felt in Clara's hands like the first genuine light she'd seen since Thorne's wagons first rolled up this same road what felt like a lifetime ago rather than mere days. That night, sleep proved impossible despite the exhaustion weighing on every part of her body, and Clara found herself once again on the porch. This time joined not by fear alone, but by something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. A feeling so unfamiliar after 14 years of dread that she barely recognized it for what it was. Ethan joined her without needing to be asked, settling into the chair beside hers with the particular quiet of a man who understood some conversations required no words to begin. 3 days, Clara said, eventually breaking the silence. 3 days, he agreed. "I keep thinking about what happens after. If Judge Whitfield rules in our favor, if the forgery holds up, if the whole company crumbles under the weight of what they did to me and probably countless others before me." She turned to look at him, moonlight catching the exhaustion and the hope both written plain across her face. "I don't know what comes after 14 years of running, Ethan. I've never let myself imagine it because imagining it always felt like tempting fate to take it away before I could reach it. What do you want it to look like?" The question landed simply without pressure, exactly the way Ethan seemed to ask most things, and Clara found herself answering with more honesty than she'd offered anyone in longer than she could remember. "I want to keep making quilts. Not for a company ledger, not for wages that never balance in my favor, just for myself, for people who want something made with actual care instead of extracted labor. I want to wake up somewhere and not listen for wagon wheels before I've even opened my eyes. That's not much to ask for, considering what you've survived to get here. Isn't it 14 years told me it was an impossible request, that a woman like me didn't get to want ordinary things, only permitted things, approved things, things that fit neatly into somebody else's ledger of what my life was allowed to contain?" Her voice caught, and this time she didn't try to hide it from him. "I don't know how to want things freely yet, Ethan. I'm still learning the shape of it." "Then learn it here," he said, quiet and certain. "Whatever the judge decides in 3 days, this ranch is yours to stay on as long as you want it, with no ledger attached, no debt, no expectation." I meant that the first night I said it, and I mean it more now than I did then. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, warm and frightening in equal measure. And before she could think better of it, before 14 years of careful self-protection could talk her out of it, she reached over and took his hand. Calluses, meeting calluses. 2 different kinds of hard-earned labor, finally resting together in the dark. "Ethan." "Yeah, I think I'm done being afraid of wanting things." Her voice shook slightly, but she didn't let go of his hand. "I think I want this. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I want to find out without a deadline hanging over it, without a company forcing my hand, without anything except my own heart telling me the truth exactly like you said." He turned to look at her fully, then something raw and hopeful breaking through the careful composure he'd maintained since the day they'd met. Clara, I need you to be certain, because I already told you I won't be the next man who... I know what you told me, and I'm telling you now, clear-eyed, with no deadline forcing my hand, that I want this. I want you. Not as a legal strategy, not as protection from Thorn, but because you're the first person in 14 years who ever asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I owed. The kiss that followed was gentle, unhurried. Nothing like the desperate collision of two people running from danger, but rather the quiet, deliberate choice of two people finally standing still long enough to choose each other freely. And when they finally broke apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the warm summer dark. 3 days, he murmured. 3 days, she agreed. And then, whatever comes after. They sat together long into the night, hands intertwined. The fear of what waited in Willow Creek's courthouse, tempered now by something neither of them had expected to find amid all the wreckage Thorn had tried to bury them under. And for the first time since her mother's death, Clara let herself believe cautiously, fiercely, that she might actually be allowed to keep something good without it being taken from her by men who valued ledgers over lives. The 3 days passed in a strange blend of vigilance and quiet domesticity, the ranch hands maintaining watch through each night, while daylight hours filled with the ordinary rhythms of rebuilding mending and preparing testimony with Amos Reed, who rode out twice more to help Clara organize the evidence into something a judge could follow clearly. Judge Whitfield is thorough, Reed told her on his second visit, spreading his notes across the kitchen table while Martha kept coffee flowing between them. He won't be swayed by sympathy alone, Miss Whitmore. You'll need to walk him through the timeline plainly without embellishment, and let the facts carry the weight rather than the emotion behind them. The facts are enough, Clara said. They shouldn't need embellishment. They're more than enough. I only mean to prepare you for how cold the room will feel when you're standing in it. A courtroom strips the humanity out of even the clearest injustice if you let it, reducing 14 years of your life to dates and exhibits and sworn statements read aloud in a flat, official voice. Reed's expression softened slightly, some genuine concern showing through his professional caution. I've seen strong witnesses falter under that coldness, not because their case was weak, but because nobody warned them how strange it would feel to have their suffering treated as evidence rather than experience. I've spent 14 years being treated as a line item in somebody else's ledger, Mr. Reed. I don't imagine a courtroom will feel any colder than that. Reed studied her a long moment, something like respect settling into his young face. No, I don't suppose it will. He tapped the false indenture now sitting beside the Bible in a neat stack of evidence. Walk me through it once more, from the beginning, exactly as you'll tell it to the judge. Clara did her voice steady, through the retelling in a way it hadn't been the first time she'd spoken it aloud to Ethan on that first night, the fear of the story slowly giving way to something closer to simple, hard-won fact. And by the time she finished, even Martha had gone quiet at the stove, listening with an expression that mixed old anger with fierce protective pride. That's it, Reed said, gathering his notes. Told exactly like that, plain and unflinching. No judge worth his robes could hear it and rule any other way. And if he does? Clara asked, the fear resurfacing despite herself. If Thorne's company has more influence in that capital than we know, if the judge finds some reason to side with paperwork over truth regardless of the forgery, then we appeal, and we keep appealing, and we make enough noise that no court in this territory can quietly bury what happened to you without the whole territory hearing about it eventually. Reed's voice carried a conviction that surprised her, given how nervous he'd seemed at their very first meeting. I didn't take this case for the fee, Miss Whitmore. I took it because I've watched companies like Mercer operate in this territory for years, and I've never once had proof solid enough to actually stop them. You handed me that proof. I don't intend to let it go to waste, whatever the first ruling brings. The words settled something in Clara that she hadn't realized needed settling. A reminder that this fight, however deeply personal it felt, had never truly been about her alone. On the morning of the third day, as Clara dressed carefully in her best remaining clothes for the ride into Willow Creek, Martha appeared in the doorway of the bunkhouse office, holding something carefully wrapped in cloth. Made this for you last night, once everyone else had gone to bed. Martha unwrapped a small quilted square, clearly hastily but lovingly stitched patterns, echoing the ones Clara herself favored. Figured you ought to walk into that courtroom with proof in your hands that your mother's gift didn't die with 14 years of company theft. Figured you ought to remind that judge exactly what's actually at stake here beyond the paperwork. Clara took the small quilted square with hands that trembled, moved beyond words by the gesture, by the quiet, fierce loyalty this woman had shown her from the very first morning. Martha, I don't know how to thank you for any of this. Don't thank me. Just win, child. Win, and then come home and teach me that stitch pattern you keep favoring on the corners, because I've been trying to puzzle it out for a week, and my old fingers can't quite manage it. Clara laughed, despite the fear still coiled tight in her stomach, and the sound surprised her unfamiliar, in a way that made her realize how long it had been since laughter had come easily. Ethan waited by the wagon, freshly shaved, wearing his one good coat, looking every bit as nervous as Clara felt, despite his usual composed calm. Ready? No, Clara admitted. But I'm going anyway. That's the only kind of ready that's ever mattered. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and as they pulled away from the ranch, Clara looked back once at the half-rebuilt barn at Martha, waving from the porch at Wyatt and Tom, and the other hands pausing their work to watch them go, and felt something steady settle into her chest, despite everything still uncertain waiting in Willow Creek. They were perhaps a mile down the road when Tom came riding up hard behind them. His horse lathered from a fast gallop, his face carrying news that made Clara's stomach drop before he'd even opened his mouth. Ethan! Wait! Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop, twisting in his seat, as Tom drew alongside, breathless. What is it? Word just came through from Willow Creek. Garrett Thorne's gone. Left town sometime in the night along with 2 of his clerks. Bank manager says he closed out whatever accounts the company kept locally before he rode out, and nobody's seen hide nor hair of him since. Clara felt the news land like a physical blow. Hope and dread tangling together in a knot she couldn't quite untangle. He's running. Looks that way, Tom said. Question is whether he's running from the judge or running toward something worse before the judge ever gets the chance to rule. What could be worse than a fraud conviction? Clara asked, though even as the words left her mouth, a cold thought was already forming behind them. A man that desperate might decide the only way to keep his freedom is to make sure the witness against him never makes it to that courtroom at all. Ethan said grimly, voicing the exact fear Clara hadn't wanted to speak aloud herself. You think he'd come back alone with nothing left to lose? No company standing behind him to soften whatever he decided to do. I think a man who forged a dead woman's signature and burned a barn to intimidate a rancher isn't the kind of man who simply accepts defeat and rides quietly into obscurity. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins, some new calculation working behind his eyes. Tom, ride back and tell the men to keep the watch doubled, regardless of whether we're at the ranch or in town. And send word ahead to Marshal Coyle. If Thorne's desperate enough to run, he might be desperate enough to try something the law can actually catch him for this time. On it. Tom wheeled his horse and was gone in a spray of dust, leaving Ethan and Clara alone on the road, with the weight of the news settling heavy between them. We should turn back. Clara said, the old instinct to disappear to make herself smaller and safer rising up, despite everything she'd promised herself in recent days. If he's out there somewhere unpredictable with nothing left to lose, then hiding won't save you any more than it saved you the first 8 months you spent running from him. Ethan said, gentle but unwavering. Clara, look at me. We go to that courthouse today exactly as planned, because the moment we let his desperation change our course, he's already won something he doesn't deserve to win. I won't let that happen. Not after everything it's cost to get this far. Clara sat with that a long moment. The fear still coiled tight in her chest, but beneath it something steadier. Something that had been growing quietly ever since the night she'd first refused to stand at a window and watch her wagon taken. All right, she said finally. We go. Together. Together, Ethan agreed and snapped the reins. The wagon lurching forward down the same road that had first carried her, frightened and alone into a life she'd never once let herself imagine wanting. They hadn't gone another half-mile before Clara noticed it, a subtle wrongness in the tree line ahead, where the road curved through a stand of cottonwoods, a stillness too complete for a summer morning that should have carried birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Ethan," she said quietly, her hand finding his arm. Something's not right up ahead. He'd already noticed it too. She realized his body gone tense and alert beside her, his eyes scanning the tree line with the same wary focus she'd first seen in him the morning Thorne's wagons arrived. "Get down low," he murmured, slowing the wagon without stopping entirely, his free hand moving toward the rifle tucked beneath the seat. "Whatever happens, Clara, you stay behind me." And then from the shadows of the cottonwoods, a lone figure stepped out into the road ahead of them, and Clara's breath caught as she recognized, even at this distance, the fine coat and cold, calculating posture of a man she'd hoped never to see standing directly in her path again. Garrett Thorne stood in the middle of the road with his hands loose at his sides. No rifle, no clerks, no satchel of false papers. Just a man stripped down to whatever remained of him once every other advantage had been taken away. "Mr. Hale, Miss Whitmore." His voice carried none of its old, cold confidence. "I only want to talk. You had 3 days to talk through proper channels," Ethan said, not lowering the rifle resting across his lap. "Instead, you ran in the night like a man with something to hide. Forgive me if I don't take your word that this is a friendly conversation. I'm not here to hurt anyone." Thorne's eyes moved to Clara, and something in them had changed since the last time she'd seen him. Some brittle desperation replacing the smooth calculation he'd worn like armor every previous visit. "I'm here because in 3 hours, you're going to walk into a courtroom and destroy everything I've spent 20 years building, and I wanted the chance to ask you not to, before it's too late for either of us to change course. You forged my mother's signature," Clara said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered against her ribs. "You spent 14 years telling a child she owed a debt that never existed. There's no version of this conversation that ends with me changing course, Mr. Thorne. I didn't create the system, Miss Whitmore. I inherited it. Elijah Mercer built that indenture structure 30 years ago, refined it, protected it with lawyers smarter than any territorial judge is likely to have encountered. I simply administered what was already built long before I ever took the position." That's not an excuse. That's a confession with better posture, perhaps. Thorne's composure cracked further, something almost pleading entering his voice. "But I'm not the only one who profits from what happens today. You destroy this indenture. This court case sets precedent, and every indenture the company holds becomes vulnerable to the same challenge. Do you understand what that means for me personally? Miss Whitmore, I have no other trade. I've spent 20 years learning to administer contracts, not raise cattle or work a forge. If the company falls, I fall with it, and I'll have nothing left to show for 2 decades of loyal service." "Loyal service." Clara repeated, something cold entering her own voice now. "Is that what you call forging a grieving widow's signature loyal service to whom, Mr. Thorne?" "Not to me. Not to my mother, who never got the chance to know her daughter's labor was being stolen out from under her before she'd even finished grieving her husband. You built your comfortable position on the backs of children too young and too frightened to question what they were told. And now you stand in this road asking me to feel sorry for the fact that the machine you operated for 2 decades might finally stop turning. I never set out to hurt anyone. Intentions don't undo 14 years, Mr. Thorne. They never have." Clara felt Ethan's hand tighten briefly around the rifle beside her, though he said nothing, letting her finish what she'd clearly needed to say for longer than she'd realized. "You had every opportunity to walk away from this system the moment you understood what it truly cost the people caught inside it. You chose comfort instead. I don't owe you sympathy for finally facing what that choice cost you." Something in Thorne's face finally collapsed entirely, the last vestige of the cold, composed man who'd first climbed down from his wagon, giving way to something smaller, more frightened, more human in its defeat than Clara had ever expected to witness from him. "If you testify, the company collapses. Not just my position, Miss Whitmore, the entire operation. Every contract, every indenture currently active across 3 territories. Do you understand how many people that puts out of work? How many families depend on wages from mills and workshops that only exist because of the very system you're about to help a judge dismantle? How many of those wages were built on stolen labor? Clara shot back. How many other girls signed contracts at 14 with forged signatures? Standing behind them told they owed debts that existed only on paper designed to trap them. You're not asking me to spare innocent families. Mr. Thorne, you're asking me to protect the very machine that manufactured my entire childhood as raw material for your ledgers. Thorne opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching horses cut through whatever argument he'd been preparing, and Clara watched his face drain of what little color remained as 3 riders came around the bend behind him. Marshal Coyle at their lead, a pair of deputies flanking him, with the particular grim purpose of men who'd ridden hard to catch someone before he slipped away entirely. Garrett Thorne, Coyle called out, reining up. I've got a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted intimidation of a witness in an active territorial court matter. Bank examiner in Willow Creek found some very interesting irregularities in the accounts you closed out last night. The kind of irregularities that tend to follow a man his whole life once a judge starts looking. This is a misunderstanding. Thorne started backing a step. Save it for the judge. Coyle dismounted one hand, resting easy near his own weapon, though his voice carried no more heat than it had the first day he'd arrived at the ranch. Mr. Hale, Miss Whitmore, apologies for the delay. Got word from your man Tom late last night that Thorne had run, and I had a suspicion a man that desperate might try one more conversation before facing what's coming. Glad we arrived before that conversation turned into anything worse. It wasn't going to turn into anything worse, Thorne said, though nobody standing in that road seemed inclined to believe him, least of all Clara, who had spent 14 years learning exactly how far men like Thorne would go once cornered. The deputies moved forward to secure his hands, and Thorne's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely, his voice rising with something between fury and panic as they walked him toward their horses. You have no idea what you're unleashing, Miss Whitmore. The company has resources, connections, judges in territories you've never even heard of. This isn't over. It is for you, Clara said quietly, and something in the plain certainty of it seemed to land harder than any of his own threats ever had, because Thorne fell silent after that, allowing himself to be led away. Without further protest, a man finally understanding that the story he'd been telling himself about his own untouchability had run entirely out of road. Coyle tipped his hat to Clara once the deputies had Thorne mounted and secured. Miss Whitmore, I believe you've got a courthouse waiting on you. I'd be honored to escort you both the rest of the way if you'll have me. We'd welcome the company marshal, Ethan said, and something in his voice carried the first full release of tension Clara had heard from him since the moment Tom had ridden up with news of Thorne's disappearance. The rest of the ride passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Clara's hands folded tight around her mother's scorched Bible, the weight of everything still ahead of her pressing down even as the immediate danger finally receded behind them. Willow Creek's courthouse stood at the center of town, a modest brick building that seemed almost absurdly ordinary given the enormity of what was about to unfold inside it, and Clara felt her breath catch as she climbed the front steps, Ethan's hand steady at the small of her back. Judge Harmon Whitfield was a spare, silver-haired man with the kind of stillness that made the whole courtroom quiet the moment he entered, and Clara found herself grateful at least that his face gave away nothing, neither sympathy nor skepticism. Simply the patient attention of a man who intended to hear every piece of evidence before forming a single opinion. The Mercer Trading Company had sent a replacement lawyer in Thorne's absence, a polished, unbothered man named Vance Alder, who opened proceedings by attempting to dismiss the entire matter as a rancher's dispute over property unrelated to any indenture whatsoever. Your Honor, my client purchased 11 quilts fairly. Whatever grievance Miss Whitmore holds against a former employer is respectfully outside the scope of a simple commercial transaction. I'd remind counsel. Judge Whitfield said, his voice mild but immovable, that the complaint before this court concerns an allegation of forgery against a legally binding indenture, not the sale of quilts. If your client would prefer, I can simply proceed to examining the document in question without further preamble. Alder's composure flickered, the first small crack Clara had learned to recognize as a company man's confidence. Meeting resistance it hadn't anticipated. Of course, Your Honor. Reed rose to present the case, and Clara watched him transform from the nervous young attorney who'd first spread documents across his own kitchen table into something steadier, sharper, a man who'd clearly spent every waking hour of the last 3 days preparing for exactly this moment. Your Honor, I'd like to submit 2 documents for the court's examination. The first, an indenture contract presented by the Mercer Trading Company, purporting to bear the signature of Margaret Whitmore, mother of the witness. The second, a family Bible containing Margaret Whitmore's authenticated signature, written in her own hand, the year she and her daughter arrived at the company's works. The clerk carried both documents forward, and Judge Whitfield examined them for a long, silent moment that stretched Clara's nerves to their breaking point before finally setting them side by side on his desk with a small, precise motion. These signatures are not the same hand, the judge said simply. Your Honor, handwriting can vary over time. Alder interjected. A signature written under duress or years apart might reasonably show some variation. Counselor, this isn't minor variation. One signature is written in flowing cursive script. The other is written in careful, uneven block letters, the unmistakable hand of someone still learning to write. Judge Whitfield's tone carried the first hint of something sharper. I've presided over enough forgery cases in this territory to recognize the difference between natural variation and an entirely different person's handwriting. Miss Whitmore, would you care to testify as to your mother's education? Clara rose her legs unsteady, but her voice when it came clear and unwavering. My mother never learned to read or write until I taught her myself when I was 9 years old. She could write her name slowly in block letters, exactly as it appears in that Bible. She never once in all the years I knew her wrote in cursive script. She didn't know how. And this indenture, Whitfield said, indicating the forged document, was signed according to company records when you were 14 years old, 5 years after you say you taught her to write. Yes, Your Honor. Did your mother's handwriting change in those 5 years? Did she learn cursive in the interim? No, sir. She never had the time or the teaching for it. She worked 14 hours a day at the company work, same as I did. There was no leisure in that life for learning new skills that weren't required for company production. Alder attempted another objection. Something about hearsay and second-hand knowledge of the mother's education. But Judge Whitfield waved it aside, with the particular impatience of a man who had already made up his mind, and saw no further use in delaying the inevitable. Counselor, I've seen enough forged documents in my career to know one when it's placed directly beside authentic proof. This indenture bears a signature that does not match the only other known example of Margaret Whitmore's handwriting produced years earlier under circumstances with no motive for deception. I find the indenture presented by the Mercer Trading Company to be fraudulent. A murmur moved through the small gallery of townspeople who'd gathered to watch the proceedings, and Clara felt Ethan's hand find hers beneath the table, steady and warm. Though her own eyes had gone blurry with tears she hadn't expected to shed. Alder rose again, visibly rattled, but unwilling to concede without one final attempt. Your Honor, even granting the forgery the witness's own signature at 14 remains valid under territorial contract law. A renewal signed by the party herself, regardless of the original document's authenticity, could still bind her to the terms therein. Counselor, Judge Whitfield said, his patience visibly thinning. Are you suggesting a 14-year-old child informed that her deceased mother's forged debt would fall upon her regardless of her wishes, freely and knowingly entered into a binding contract? The law does not require perfect circumstances. Your Honor, only a signature freely given. Miss Whitmore, the judge said, turning to Clara directly. I'll ask you plainly. When you signed that renewal at 14, were you told you had any choice in the matter? Clara rose again, steadier this time, something fierce settling into her voice. I was told my mother had died owing a debt, and that debt would transfer to me whether I signed or not. But signing meant I'd at least be permitted to keep working in familiar surroundings, rather than being sent to a company facility in another territory where I knew no one. I was 14 years old, Your Honor, recently orphaned, and told my only choice was between two versions of the same cage. Whitfield's expression for the first time showed something beyond judicial neutrality. A flash of genuine anger quickly reined back into professional composure. That is not consent, counselor. That is coercion dressed in the language of choice, and I will not treat it as a binding contract in this court. Alder sat down without further argument, and Reed rose once more, a folded letter in his hand, that Clara hadn't seen before that moment. Your Honor, with the court's indulgence, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence received only this morning by messenger from a woman named Bethany Cross, formerly of the Mercer Works in the Eastern Territory. Objection, Alder said weakly. This wasn't disclosed prior to today's proceedings. It arrived after opposing counsel's own witness fled custody in the night, Your Honor. I'd argue the timing speaks for itself. Reed's voice carried the confidence of a man who knew he'd already won and was simply choosing to make the victory unmistakable. The letter describes an identical indenture, identical forged signature style, and an identical pattern of debt that never diminished despite years of labor. Miss Cross writes that she has lived in hiding for 6 years, afraid to return to her family, for fear of the very company now standing accused in this courtroom. Judge Whitfield accepted the letter, reading it in silence that stretched long enough for Clara to hear her own heartbeat in her ears, before finally setting it down with the same quiet, precise motion he'd used with the forged indenture. This corroborates a pattern, not an isolated incident. Miss Whitmore's case is troubling enough on its own merits. Evidence suggesting it reflects standard company practice across territories changes the entire scope of what this court is obligated to address. The murmur in the gallery rose louder this time, and Clara felt something shift in the room's atmosphere entirely, the sense that she was no longer simply fighting for her own freedom, but had become, without ever intending it, the crack in a dam that had been holding back years of quiet suffering belonging to women she'd never even met. Furthermore, Whitfield continued, given the severity of this finding, and given reports reaching this court of similar indenture contracts issued by the Mercer Trading Company across 3 territories, I am ordering a full territorial investigation into the company's contracting practices, effective immediately. Any individual currently bound by an indenture issued under similar circumstances is entitled to petition this court for review. Alder's face had gone the color of old paper. Your Honor, that's an extraordinarily broad ruling based on a single case. It's a single case with proof solid enough to demand broader scrutiny. Counselor, I'd encourage your employer to prepare accordingly, because I suspect Miss Whitmore will not be the last woman to walk through these doors once word of today's ruling spreads. Whitfield's gavel came down with quiet finality. The indenture is voided effective immediately and retroactively. Miss Whitmore owes the Mercer Trading Company nothing, and any further attempt by the company or its representatives to pursue, threaten, or intimidate her will be treated as contempt of this court's ruling, in addition to whatever criminal charges Marshal Coyle sees fit to pursue regarding the events at the Hale Ranch. The courtroom erupted into a low buzz of conversation, and Clara sat very still amid it, the weight of 14 years finally genuinely lifting from her shoulders, in a way that felt almost too large to fully comprehend all at once. It's over, Ethan said quietly beside her, his voice thick with something that might have been relief, or might have been the beginning of tears he was too proud to fully let fall. It's over. Clara repeated, testing the words like she didn't quite trust them yet, like 14 years of conditioning wouldn't allow her to accept victory without bracing for some hidden cost still waiting to reveal itself. But no hidden cost came. Alder gathered his papers and left without another word, defeated in a way that suggested the company's troubles were only beginning, and Reed approached the table with an expression of pure, unguarded joy that Clara suspected rarely crossed a lawyer's face in that particular courthouse. Miss Whitmore, I don't believe I've ever seen a ruling that broad delivered from that bench. You didn't just win your own freedom today. You may have just freed women in this indenture system you've never even met. I didn't do it alone, Clara said, looking at Ethan at Martha's careful stitches, sitting folded in her lap, at the memory of Tom riding hard to fetch a marshal of Wyatt, standing with a rifle in a yard he'd once resented her presence in. None of this happened because I was strong enough to do it by myself. It happened because people who didn't have to stand beside me chose to anyway. Marshal Coyle, lingering near the courthouse door, tipped his hat as they passed. Miss Whitmore, for what it's worth, I've seen a great many folks pass through that courtroom in 11 years, wearing far less courage than you carried in there today. Territory's better for having you stand your ground in it. Thank you, Marshal, for coming when you did. Wasn't going to let a man like Thorne finish what he started, not after watching you refuse to run from it 3 separate times already. Coyle's weathered face creased into something like a smile. Go home, Miss Whitmore. Rest easy. I don't imagine you'll be seeing any more wagons on that road you don't invite yourself. They rode back to the ranch as the afternoon light turned gold across the summer fields, and Clara felt something settle inside her that she hadn't experienced in longer than she could clearly remember. A quiet, bone-deep sense that the ground beneath her feet finally belonged to her as much as it belonged to anyone, that no wagon coming up the road would ever again carry a man with the authority to claim otherwise. Martha met them at the porch with a fierceness of embrace that surprised Clara with its intensity. The older woman's shoulders shaking slightly as she held on longer than strictly necessary. Tom rode ahead with the news the moment the marshal's deputy came through with word of the ruling. Whole ranch has been waiting on you two to come home and confirm it proper. It's confirmed. Ethan said, his arm settling around Clara's shoulders, in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over these past days. Indentures voided. Thorne's in custody. Company's about to face an investigation across 3 territories. A cheer rose up from the men gathered near the rebuilt barn frame. Wyatt among them, his rifle long since traded for a hammer, and Clara found herself laughing despite the tears still standing in her eyes, overwhelmed by a kind of joy she'd never once allowed herself to imagine feeling, not once in 14 years of careful, guarded survival. That evening, once the celebration had settled into quiet contentment, and most of the ranch had finally drifted to sleep, Clara found Ethan waiting for her on the porch. The same porch where he'd first offered her a room with no ledger attached. The same porch where she'd first taken his hand in the dark. I have something to ask you, he said. And something in his voice carried a different weight than it had 3 nights before, no legal urgency behind it. Now no deadline forcing either of their hands. Ask then. He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, simple, unadorned clearly, not purchased in some hurried afternoon, but carried with him, she suspected, for at least a day or two, waiting for the right moment to offer it. Clara Whitmore, I'm not asking you this because a lawyer suggested it, or because a company forced our hand, or because there's any deadline hanging over either of us anymore. I'm asking because I love you plainly and completely, and because I want to spend whatever years I've got left, learning every corner of who you are, free and clear, with nothing owed and nothing owned. Clara felt her throat tighten the same way it had the very first night he'd told her nobody had said such a thing to her in 14 years. Except this time the words carried no fear. Alongside them, only a bright, steady certainty that had been building quietly since the moment she'd first refused to run from his ranch. Yes, she said, before he'd even finished lowering himself to one knee. Yes, Ethan Hale, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed carried none of the desperate uncertainty of the first. Only the settled, joyful confidence of 2 people who had earned through fire and fraud and armed men on a dusty road the right to choose each other freely, without anyone's ledger standing between them. They married 3 weeks later in the yard, where Thorne's wagons had once rolled up, demanding ownership of everything. Clara held dear. The same ground now decorated with wildflowers Martha had gathered at dawn, and quilts hung from the freshly rebuilt barn, like banners declaring exactly what this land had come to represent. Half of Willow Creek turned out for the ceremony, drawn as much by curiosity about the woman whose court case had already begun toppling one of the territory's most powerful companies, as by genuine goodwill, though by the end of the celebration, Clara suspected most of them left as the latter rather than the former. Wyatt gave a toast that made Martha cry, and Tom laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink, something about a man learning the difference between fear and wisdom. and how he was grateful this particular ranch had taught him that lesson without costing anyone their life in the process. "I judged you the moment you climbed down off that wagon, ma'am," he said, raising his glass toward Clara with genuine warmth, replacing every trace of his earlier suspicion. "Figured you were trouble wearing a quiet face. Turns out I was half right. You were trouble all right, just not the kind any of us should have been afraid of." Martha herself finally mastered the corner stitch pattern she'd been chasing for weeks, presenting Clara with a small quilted square of her own making, as a wedding gift, imperfect, in exactly the way that made it precious. "Took me longer to learn than it should have," Martha admitted, pressing the square into Clara's hands, with fingers that trembled slightly with emotion rather than age. "But I figure some things are worth taking your time over, same as this whole business between you and Ethan turned out to be. Thank you, Martha, for all of it. For the mending pile that first morning, for the biscuits, for standing in that doorway with a shotgun like it was the most natural thing in the world. Wasn't nothing but plain decency, child. World's got precious little of it left. Figured I'd contribute what I could." Martha's eyes glistened, though her voice stayed characteristically brisk. "Now go dance with your husband before Tom talks his ear off about cattle prices for the rest of the evening." Reed sent word a month later that the territorial investigation into the Mercer Trading Company had uncovered 11 other forged indentures across 3 territories, each one now voided, each woman named in those documents finally free of debts that had never legally existed in the first place. Elijah Mercer himself, the company's founder, faced federal fraud charges that would eventually see the entire operation dissolved within the year its assets liquidated, to pay restitution to the very women it had spent decades exploiting. Bethany Cross, the woman whose letter had arrived just in time to broaden Clara's case into something larger than a single grievance, wrote to say she'd finally returned home to her family in the Eastern Territory, no longer afraid of wagons appearing on her own horizon. Clara opened a small workshop behind the ranch house that autumn, teaching Martha the corner stitch, at last taking on 2 young women from Willow Creek, who'd heard about her case and wanted to learn a trade that belonged entirely to the person who practiced it. No company ledger standing behind the loom to claim what their hands produced as anything other than their own. She named the workshop after her mother, a small painted sign hung above the door reading simply, "Margaret's Hands." And every quilt that left that workshop carried a small embroidered signature in the corner, Clara's own careful stitching proof beyond dispute of exactly whose work it had always been. On the evening of her wedding day, standing on the porch with Ethan's arm around her shoulders, watching the last of the guests ride off down the same road that had once carried 3 wagons full of men who believed they owned her, Clara understood with complete and unshakable clarity that the fight had never truly been about 11 quilts or a forged signature or even a company's cruel machinery of debt and control. Regretting any of it? Ethan asked quietly, watching her face in the last of the summer light. "Not one moment," she said. "Not the fire, not the fear, not even the 14 years that came before I ever found this road. Every part of it brought me here standing beside a man who never once asked me to be smaller than I actually am. I used to think surviving Anna's death meant never risking anything again," Ethan said. "Turns out surviving just meant waiting for something worth risking everything for a second time." And was I worth it? The barn, the loan, the danger. Clara Whitmore, you were worth considerably more trouble than a barn. He pressed a kiss to her temple, warm and unhurried. "Ask me again in 50 years. I expect the answer's only going to get more certain." Clara laughed, the sound easy now, in a way it had never been in all her years at the company works, and turned to look out at the darkening fields, at the rebuilt barn standing solid against the horizon, at the quilts still hanging from its rafters, like proof of everything she'd refused to let be taken. It had been about whether a woman's hands and everything they created could ever truly belong to anyone but herself. Somewhere behind her, inside the house, Martha's lamp still burned low in the kitchen window, and somewhere further out past the fence line, the mule that had carried Clara up this road as a frightened, hungry stranger now grazed contentedly in a pasture that belonged in every way that mattered to the woman who had refused to let it be taken from her not once, but twice. And standing there, in the golden hush of a summer evening, free for the first time in her entire life, Clara Whitmore finally knew the answer, whole and certain. And hers alone, to keep what she made with her own two hands, had always been hers, and no ledger, no company, and no man with a fine coat and a fraudulent claim would ever again convince her otherwise.